My father threw me out on Christmas Eve with nothing but the clothes on my back. No coat, no phone, no money. Just accusations of stealing $10,000 I'd never seen, lies my own sister told to cover her tracks. I sat on a frozen park bench watching families celebrate through lit windows, my breath forming clouds in the sub-zero air. I was about to lose consciousness when I saw him, a man collapsed on the next bench barefoot, turning blue, minutes from death. I knew what I had to do. Even though those boots were all I had left in this world, even though removing them meant I might not survive the night myself, I couldn't let another human being die. The moment I laced those worn boots onto his frozen feet, I heard it. Engines, growling, powerful. 6 black SUVs surrounded us like something out of a movie. Men in tactical gear emerged, and the man I'd saved, the stranger I thought was homeless, stood up and looked at me with eyes that held secrets worth billions. "You saved the wrong man tonight, Valerie," he whispered. Then he said 5 words that would destroy my family and rebuild my entire life. I know what they did. What I didn't know. This wasn't just any stranger. He was Isaiah Ward, a tech billionaire with unlimited resources and a 20-year vendetta. And my act of kindness had just triggered a chain of events that would expose every lie, punish every betrayal, and transform me from a homeless outcast into the woman who brought down an empire. But first I had to learn the truth about what really happened to my mother. My name is Valerie Thomas. I'm 28 years old, and until tonight I worked as an administrative assistant at a small insurance company, the kind of job that pays just enough to get by but never enough to get ahead. I grew up in this house, spent my whole life trying to be the daughter my father wanted, and thought I understood what family meant. I was wrong about everything. The Christmas tree lights cast a warm glow across the living room as I stood frozen in the doorway, my father's finger pointed at me like a weapon. The room had gone silent. 20 relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins who'd traveled from 3 states away for our annual Christmas Eve celebration stared at me with expressions that ranged from shock to disgust. The air smelled of pine and cinnamon scents that had always meant comfort and home. Now they felt suffocating. $10,000, Valerie. My father's voice shook with rage, his face red above his collar. From the charity fund. Money meant for families who have nothing, and you stole it. The words didn't make sense. I blinked at him, trying to process what he was saying. What charity fund, Dad? I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. He slammed his hand on the armrest of his chair, making my Aunt Carol jump. We have the bank statements, your name, your signatures. How could you do this on Christmas Eve of all nights? My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked around the room, searching for an ally, someone who knew me well enough to understand this was insane. My sister Melanie sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, eyes downcast. She should have been defending me. We'd shared a bedroom for 15 years, told each other secrets, braided each other's hair before school dances. But she sat there silent as stone, and something cold slithered down my spine. I didn't steal anything, I said, hearing the desperation creep into my voice. I don't even have access to any charity accounts. Dad, please, there's been a mistake. No mistake. That voice came from the corner, and I turned to see Mark Anderson stepping forward. Mark, who I dated for 6 months 2 years ago. Mark, who my family had loved more than they ever loved me, apparently. Mark, who was somehow at our family Christmas, despite the fact that we'd broken up and barely spoken since. Valerie, I tried to help you. I really did. My mouth fell open. What are you talking about? Mark's expression was perfectly calibrated concern mixed with disappointment, like a teacher facing a wayward student. I noticed the discrepancies months ago. Small amounts at first, then larger withdrawals. I came to you privately, remember? Asked if you needed help if you were in some kind of trouble. But you shut me down. Told me to mind my own business. That never happened. The words burst out of me. "Mark, we haven't had a real conversation in over a year. What is this?" But I could see it in their faces, they believed him. Every single person in that room believed the clean-cut, charming man who'd always known exactly what to say over the daughter who'd worked double shifts to help pay for her father's medical bills last year, who'd given up her college fund so Melanie could attend that expensive private school she wanted. Melanie finally spoke, her voice small and trembling. "Valerie's been different lately. Distant. Spending money on new clothes, going out to restaurants." She looked up at me, and for just a fraction of a second, I saw something flicker across her face. Not guilt. Something sharper. Satisfaction. Then it was gone, replaced by theatrical concern. I didn't want to believe it, but Mark showed me the evidence. The bank statements don't lie. "Melanie," my voice broke on her name. "You know I haven't been buying new clothes. You know the only restaurant I can afford is the diner where I eat lunch alone because I can't take time off work. Why are you doing this?" She turned away, wiping at imaginary tears. My father stood up, his considerable frame blocking the light from the tree. "I will not have a thief under my roof. Not tonight. Not ever. You need to leave." The room spun. "Dad, it's Christmas Eve. It's 20 degrees outside. Where am I supposed to go?" "You should have thought of that before you stole from families in need." His face was granite, unmovable. "You're no longer welcome here." I looked at Melanie one more time silently, begging her to tell the truth, to remember all the times I'd protected her, covered for her, sacrificed for her. She stared at her hands. The walk to the front door felt like a death march. No one spoke. No one moved to stop him as my father grabbed my purse from the hall table, dumped its contents on the floor, and took my phone. "Bought with family money, I'm sure," he muttered. He pocketed my wallet, too, leaving me with nothing but my house keys and the clothes I was wearing. A thin sweater and jeans, no coat because I'd been inside all evening helping prepare dinner. At the door, he delivered the final blow. His voice dropped low, meant only for me. "You're just like your mother, nothing but trouble. I should have seen this coming." The comparison struck me like a physical blow. My mother had died 10 years ago, and she'd been the only person in this family who'd ever truly seen me, truly loved me without conditions. To have him twist her memory into an insult to weaponize the one pure love I'd ever known was more than I could bear. He shut the door in my face. I stood on the porch, snowflakes landing on my hair, my arms, my inadequate sweater. Through the front window, I could see them returning to their celebration. Someone turned the music back on. My aunt was already handing around plates of pie, and Melanie, my baby sister. The girl I'd raised as much as our mother had hugged our father, her face pressed against his shoulder. When she pulled back, I saw it clearly, that small, satisfied smile. She'd planned this. All of it. The temperature was dropping fast, and I had nowhere to go. No phone to call anyone, no money for a hotel, even if I could reach one, no friends close enough to impose on during Christmas Eve. I started walking my thin flats, crunching through fresh snow, my breath coming out in visible clouds. I stepped into the snow, unaware that everything I thought I knew about my family was about to collapse. 2 blocks felt like 2 miles in the freezing wind. My feet had already gone numb in the thin house slippers I'd worn while cooking dinner back when I still had a home, back when I still believed I had a family. The snow was coming down harder now, thick flakes that clung to my eyelashes and melted against my cheeks, mixing with tears I hadn't realized I was crying. I found the park bench by pure instinct, my body moving on autopilot while my mind tried to process what had just happened. The small neighborhood park was deserted. The playground equipment covered in white, the street lamp casting a pale yellow circle that barely penetrated the swirling snow. I collapsed onto the wooden slats, pulling my arms tight around myself, trying to conserve what little warmth remained in my body. My breath came out in clouds, each exhale a visible reminder that I was still alive, still breathing, even though part of me wished I could simply disappear into the white landscape. The bench was covered in at least 2 inches of fresh powder, and within seconds the cold seeped through my jeans, through my skin, settling into my bones. I'd read somewhere that hypothermia made you feel warm near the end, made you want to take off your clothes and lie down in the snow. I wondered how long it would take to reach that point. Through the gaps in the falling snow, I could see the lit windows of houses where families were celebrating. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere a door opened and closed, releasing a burst of warm air and the scent of roasting turkey. My own stomach twisted with hunger. I'd been so busy preparing food for others that I'd barely eaten all day. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent hours making sure everyone else was fed comfortable, happy, and now I was freezing to death 2 blocks away while they enjoyed the meal I'd cooked. That's when I heard my mother's voice. Not literally, of course, she'd been gone for 10 years, but the memory was so vivid it felt real. I was 15 again, sitting at the kitchen table crying because some girls at school had mocked my secondhand clothes. Mom had sat down beside me, taken my hands in hers, and said something I'd never forgotten. "Kindness is strength, not weakness, Valerie. The world will try to convince you that looking out for yourself is smart, that caring about others makes you a target. But the truth is, kindness takes more courage than cruelty ever could. Never let anyone make you ashamed of having a good heart." I'd tried to live by those words my entire life. And where had it gotten me? Homeless, broke, betrayed by everyone I loved. Maybe kindness wasn't strength. Maybe it was just stupidity. My vision was starting to blur at the edges when I noticed something moving on the bench across from mine. At first I thought it was just shadows and snow playing tricks on my eyes. But then I saw him clearly. A man slumped sideways, his body convulsing with violent shivers. I blinked hard, trying to focus. He wasn't dressed like the homeless men I'd sometimes seen near the downtown shelter. His coat, though torn and dirty, looked expensive, the kind of wool blend that costs more than my monthly rent. But his feet were bare, utterly exposed to the elements already turning an alarming shade of blue-white that I recognized from a first aid training I'd taken years ago. That was the color of severe frostbite, the color that preceded amputation or death. His face, half hidden by the collar of his coat, had a refined quality despite the circumstances. Strong jawline, high cheekbones, the kind of features that suggested money and education, and a life very different from dying alone in a public park. His hands, which he'd tucked under his arms in a futile attempt at warmth, looked wrong for a homeless person. The nails were clean, recently trimmed, and even through his shivers I could see the calluses of someone who worked out regularly, deliberately. What had happened to him? Robbery. An accident. Had someone beaten him and left him here to die? His eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glassy, and in that moment I saw raw terror. He was conscious enough to know he was dying, but too far gone to do anything about it. His lips moved, trying to form words, but no sound came out except a terrible rattling wheeze. I should have looked away. I should have worried about my own survival. I was already in danger. Hypothermia was setting in. My fingers were stiff, my thoughts were getting fuzzy. Adding his emergency to mine was illogical, possibly suicidal. Every practical instinct I had screamed at me to save myself. But I couldn't. God help me. I couldn't just sit there and watch another human being freeze to death. I stood on legs that barely supported my weight and stumbled across the few feet that separated our benches. Up close, he looked even worse. His breathing was shallow and irregular. His pupils were dilated, and his skin had that waxy appearance that meant his body was shutting down. Minutes. He had minutes left, maybe less. My boots weren't much cheap worn with soles that were starting to separate, but they were warm. They were all I had between my feet and the frozen ground, my only protection against the night that was trying to kill me. Taking them off would mean certain frostbite, possibly worse. I'd read enough survival articles to know that losing your boots in sub-zero weather was essentially a death sentence. I unlaced them anyway. My mother's voice echoed in my head, stronger now. Kindness is strength, not weakness. I pulled off the first boot, then the second, gasping as my feet touched the snow-covered ground. The cold was immediate and vicious, burning like fire. I knelt beside the stranger, my knees sinking into the snow, and lifted his feet one at a time, sliding the boots on as gently as I could. "Stay with me," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Please, stay with me. Help is coming." I didn't know if help was coming. I didn't even have a way to call for help, but I needed him to hold on, needed him to fight. I took his hands in mine, trying to rub warmth back into them, feeling the ice-cold skin beneath my palms. "My name is Valerie," I told him, talking to keep him conscious, to keep both of us from giving up. "You're going to be okay. Someone will find us. Someone will help." His eyes opened again, focusing on my face with surprising intensity. His lips moved, and this time I caught fragments of sound. "Ward! Danger! They—" Then his eyes rolled back and his body went limp. The moment the boots touched his feet, I heard engines growling behind me. For a moment, everything was silent except for the man's labored breathing and the soft whisper of falling snow. I kept my hands on his, desperately trying to transfer whatever warmth I had left, even as my own bare feet began to lose all feeling against the frozen ground. His body was still shaking, but less violently now. I couldn't tell if that meant he was warming up or shutting down. "Please," I said again, leaning closer to his face. "Stay awake. Talk to me. Tell me your name." His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment those eyes focused on mine with startling clarity before glazing over again. I needed to keep him conscious, needed to assess how bad his condition really was. Without thinking, I reached for his wrist to check his pulse, and that's when his coat sleeve slid back. I froze. The forearm beneath was corded with muscle, the kind of definition that doesn't come from manual labor or chance, but from dedicated, expensive training. These were the arms of someone who had a personal trainer, who spent hours in a private gym, who had both the time and resources to maintain peak physical condition. The skin was marked with calluses, but they were the calluses of someone who lifted weights and did pull-ups, not someone who'd been sleeping rough and scraping by on the streets. My gaze traveled down to his hands, which I'd been holding moments before. Yes, they were dirty, streaked with mud and what might have been blood, but underneath the grime I could see the evidence of recent professional care. The nails were evenly trimmed, the cuticles pushed back with precision. These were hands that had seen a manicurist within the past week or two. No homeless person had nails like that. The contradictions piled up in my mind like snow accumulating on the ground. His coat was torn and filthy, but the fabric itself was unmistakably high-end. I'd worked in enough office buildings to recognize expensive wool when I saw it. His hair, matted and damp with melting snow, had the cut of someone who paid serious money for their stylist. And now that I was close enough, despite the overwhelming smell of cold and fear and wet fabric, I caught the faintest trace of cologne, something woody and sophisticated, the kind advertised in magazines I couldn't afford. He gasped suddenly, his whole body tensing, and his mouth fell open. Even through my growing panic, I noticed his teeth. Perfect white straight, the kind of dental work that cost tens of thousands of dollars. Not a single filling visible, no staining, no chips. These were the teeth of someone with excellent insurance or enough cash to pay out of pocket for cosmetic perfection. Nothing about this man matched his circumstances. He didn't belong here dying in a public park. So, what had happened? My mind spun through possibilities. A mugging gone wrong. But muggers would have taken that expensive coat, would have stripped him of anything valuable. A kidnapping where he'd escaped. A business rival's attack. The scenarios playing through my head sounded like something from a thriller movie, not real life in our quiet suburban town. I needed to get a better look at him to find some clue about who he was and what had happened. Carefully, I adjusted his coat, pulling it tighter around his shoulders to trap what little body heat remained. As I did, the collar shifted, and I saw it. A watch. Still on his wrist, partially hidden by the coat sleeve, but unmistakable once I noticed it. My breath caught in my throat. I'd seen that watch before. Not in person, but in the financial magazines my father kept stacked on the coffee table, the ones he'd pore over while complaining about money and success and people who had more than we did. This particular model had been featured in an article about luxury timepieces, a limited edition piece from a Swiss manufacturer that only made $50 a year. The article had mentioned the price tag somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000, just for a watch, and this man was wearing it, right here, in a public park, while dying from exposure. The implications crashed over me like a wave. If he'd been mugged, that watch would be gone. It was literally worth more than most people's houses. No street criminal, no opportunistic thief would have left it behind, which meant either his attackers hadn't been after money or this wasn't a robbery at all. My heart hammered as I studied his face more carefully, trying to see past the gray pallor and the half-consciousness. There was something familiar about his features, something that nagged at the edge of my memory. The strong bone structure, the particular set of his jaw, the way his brows were shaped. I'd seen this face before, but where? He stirred suddenly, his lips moving. I leaned in close, my ear nearly touching his mouth, straining to hear over the wind, "Ward!" And the word was barely a breath more exhaled than spoken. "Danger. His voice was cultured, educated, even in its weakness. Not the voice of someone who'd been on the streets. The voice of someone used to being listened to, used to commanding attention. Ward. The name detonated in my brain like a bomb. Isaiah Ward. The tech billionaire who was constantly in the news, sometimes for his innovations, sometimes for his philanthropy, sometimes for the corporate battles he waged against competitors. His face had been on the cover of Fortune magazine just last month. My father had spent an entire evening ranting about people like that, who had more money than God, while honest people struggled to make ends meet. I looked at the man's face again, really looked, and felt my stomach drop. Remove the pallor. Add some color to those cheeks. Imagine those eyes alert and intelligent, instead of glazed with hypothermia. Take away the mud and the desperation and the smell of fear. It was him. It was actually him. Isaiah Ward was dying on a park bench and I'd just given him my boots. "Oh my God," I whispered. "What happened to you?" He tried to respond, his whole body tensing with effort, but before any words could form, his eyes rolled back in his head. His body went completely limp, and for one terrible moment I thought he'd died. Then I saw the slight rise and fall of his chest, the continued pulse at his throat, weak but present. I pressed my hands to his face, trying to rouse him. "Mr. Ward, Isaiah, can you hear me? What happened? Who did this to you?" No response. His breathing was growing shallower, more erratic. I had no phone, no way to call for help, no way to get him to a hospital. We were both going to die out here, and no one would find us until morning, frozen together like some kind of tragic sculpture. Then I heard it. A low rumble that didn't match the wind, growing louder by the second. Engines. Multiple engines, powerful ones approaching fast. I looked up, and the entire park suddenly blazed with light as bright headlights cut through the falling snow. The beams were blinding, turning the white landscape into something out of a dream or a nightmare. I raised my hand to shield my eyes, my heart racing, unable to see who was coming. Vehicle doors slammed one after another, the sounds overlapping. Footsteps crunched through snow, lots of footsteps moving with purpose and speed. And that was when the first SUV screeched to a stop. The first SUV was followed by another, then another, until 6 massive black vehicles surrounded us in a perfect arc. Their headlights blazed like spotlights on a stage, turning the dark park into something bright and exposed and terrifying. I couldn't see beyond the glare, couldn't make out faces or details, only shapes moving with purpose through the beams of light. Doors opened in rapid succession, the sounds overlapping like drumbeats. Men emerged from the vehicles, and even through my shock and confusion, I registered that these weren't ordinary people rushing to help. They moved with precision, their steps measured and controlled, spreading out to form a perimeter around us, as if securing a crime scene or a military objective. They wore dark tactical clothing, not quite uniforms, But not civilian clothes either. Something in between. Professional. Expensive. The kind of gear I'd only seen in movies about special forces or Secret Service agents. Each man seemed to know exactly where to position himself without verbal communication, responding to some choreography they'd rehearsed 1,000 times. One of them approached us directly, his movements careful and calculated. He dropped to one knee beside the unconscious man, setting down a medical kit that looked far more sophisticated than anything I'd seen in a hospital. The case was black, reinforced with electronic components I couldn't identify. He pulled out instruments that glowed and beeped, running them over the man's body with practiced efficiency. "Core temperature critical," he said into a small radio attached to his shoulder. "Severe hypothermia, possible frostbite to extremities. Vitals are weak but stable. He's been exposed for at least 90 minutes, maybe longer." Another man joined him, this one speaking in technical jargon that flew over my head. "Thermal blankets in position. Mobile unit standing by. We need to move him now before—" "Perimeter secure," a third voice interrupted from somewhere beyond the light. "No hostiles detected. Area is clean." Hostiles area is clean. These weren't paramedics. This wasn't a normal rescue operation. These men were treating this like a tactical extraction, like they were recovering someone from a war zone rather than a public park in suburban America. I tried to move to stand up and back away, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The cold had locked my joints, turned my muscles to stone. I could only kneel there in the snow, my bare feet completely numb now, watching as these strangers swarmed around the man I'd tried to save. One of them finally looked at me, his eyes sharp and assessing behind some kind of tactical eyewear. "Who are you? What happened here?" My mouth opened, but no words came out. What could I possibly say that would make sense? The man with the medical kit spoke again. "She's hypothermic too. Barefoot, signs of exposure. We need to—" "Move the primary first," someone else ordered. "He's the priority." Two men moved to lift the unconscious stranger, their hands reaching under his shoulders and knees with professional competence. They were treating him with a level of care and deference that made my earlier suspicions crystallize into certainty. This was Isaiah Ward. It had to be. And these men worked for him, protected him, would probably die for him if necessary. Just as they started to lift him, his eyes snapped open. The change was instantaneous and electric. One moment he was unconscious and limp, the next he was alert and radiating authority despite his weakened state. His voice, when it came, cut through the night like a blade. "Don't you dare touch her!" Every single man froze. Not gradually, not with hesitation, but immediately and completely, as if someone had pressed a pause button on the entire scene. The two men holding him stayed perfectly still, their hands still supporting his weight but making no further movement. The others stopped mid-step, mid-gesture, their entire attention focused on the man they'd come to rescue. The command in his voice was absolute. This wasn't a request or a plea, it was an order from someone who expected instant obedience and always received it. Even barely conscious, even dying from cold, he wielded more power in those 5 words than most people commanded in a lifetime. The man closest to me stepped back immediately, raising his hands in a gesture of non-aggression. Another spoke urgently into his radio. "Subject is conscious. Repeat, subject is conscious. He's protecting the civilian female." Civilian. The word choice was strange, military confirming these weren't ordinary security guards or medical personnel. These were people trained for situations I couldn't even imagine. The stranger's eyes moved across the scene, taking in his surroundings with a sharpness that seemed impossible for someone who'd been unconscious seconds ago. Then his gaze found mine, and the intensity of it made my breath catch. Those eyes held recognition. Not the vague sense of having seen someone before, but deep, certain knowledge. He looked at me like he knew me, like he'd known me for a long time, and the impossibility of it made my head spin. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less commanding. "Valerie Thomas." The sound of my name in his mouth shocked me more than anything else that had happened tonight. My full name spoken with confidence, with familiarity. We'd never met. I was certain of that. I would have remembered meeting Isaiah Ward, yet he knew me, knew my name, had somehow been expecting me. How do you... I couldn't finish the sentence. My thoughts were too fragmented, too overwhelmed by cold and fear and confusion. He tried to sit up, and his security team immediately moved to support him, their earlier freeze broken by his implied permission. They worked with coordinated efficiency, wrapping thermal blankets around his shoulders, checking his vitals with portable equipment, speaking in low voices about treatment protocols and transport options. But his eyes never left mine. There was gratitude there, yes, but also something that looked like concern. Maybe even fear. Not for himself, but for me.
"You should not be here tonight, Valerie,"
he whispered, his voice gaining strength with each word. His team had gotten him into a sitting position now, and even wrapped in emergency blankets. Even barely recovered from near death, he radiated a kind of power that made everyone around him seem smaller. "They might have seen you with me." They. The pronoun hung in the air, loaded with implications I didn't understand. Who were they? The people who'd left him here to die, the ones who'd done this to him. His security team exchanged glances, their expressions tight with worry. One of them leaned close to their leader and said something I couldn't hear, but the body language was clear. This was bad. Whatever they were, whatever it meant that I'd been seen with Isaiah Ward, these trained professionals were concerned. My mind reeled with questions I didn't know how to ask. Who was this man really? Why did he know my name? What had happened to him tonight? And why did my presence here put me in danger? Then he whispered,
"You should not be here tonight, Valerie."
The security team was moving again, their momentary pause over, but their movements had changed. They were no longer rushing to evacuate their boss. Instead, they maintained their positions, waiting for direction from the man who'd just spoken my name like he'd known it his whole life. He studied my face for a long moment before speaking again, and I saw him making some kind of decision, weighing what to tell me and what to keep hidden. Finally, he nodded as if confirming something to himself.
"My name is Isaiah Ward,"
he said, his voice stronger now, despite the thermal blankets wrapped around him and the obvious toll the cold had taken on his body.
"I suspect you've already guessed that."
The confirmation still hit me like a physical blow. Isaiah Ward. The man whose face appeared on the cover of Forbes and Fortune and Bloomberg Businessweek with almost predictable regularity. The tech genius who'd built a cybersecurity empire from nothing, who'd revolutionized how corporations and governments protected their data. His company had contracts with half the Fortune 500 and several national defense departments. I'd read articles about him being worth somewhere north of $8 billion, though exact figures were always speculative, and I'd just given him my $20 boots from Target. The absurdity of it would have made me laugh if I wasn't so cold, so confused, so completely overwhelmed by everything happening. My feet were beyond numb now, just distant blocks of ice attached to legs I could barely feel. My whole body was shaking with tremors I couldn't control. Isaiah must have noticed because something softened in his expression.
"Those boots,"
he said, gesturing weakly toward his feet, where my worn, cheap boots looked ridiculous against the backdrop of his expensive wool coat and the military-grade rescue operation surrounding us. "Those might be the most valuable thing anyone's given me in decades." The words carried such sincerity that for a moment I forgot about the cold, forgot about the men with guns and tactical gear, forgot about everything except the genuine gratitude in his eyes. This wasn't a billionaire making polite small talk or offering patronizing thanks. This was a man who understood exactly what those boots had cost me, who recognized that I'd given away my only protection to save a stranger's life. One of his security team stepped forward, a man with gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent a career in military service.
"Sir, we need to move you now."
"You require immediate medical attention, and every second we delay." "I'm not moving until she understands," Isaiah interrupted, his voice carrying that same unmistakable authority I'd heard before. "Get her something for her feet. Thermal blankets. Something warm to drink if you have it. Now." The men moved instantly, and within seconds, someone was wrapping a blanket around my shoulders while another knelt to examine my feet with professional concern. A third appeared with what looked like specialized medical boots designed for extreme cold weather emergencies. Isaiah watched them work on me before continuing. Tonight wasn't an accident, Valerie. What happened to me wasn't a mugging or random violence. Someone tried to kill me. He paused, letting that sink in. My security detail was compromised. Someone on my own team betrayed me. My vehicle was sabotaged, forcing me off the road 3 miles from here. I barely escaped with my life, and I've been running ever since, trying to stay alive long enough for my backup team to find me. My mind struggled to process this information. An assassination attempt. Against one of the wealthiest, most protected men in America. And he'd ended up here in this small suburban park dying from exposure. But why would anyone? I started then stopped because the answer was obvious. Men with that much money, that much power, made enemies. Lots of them. Isaiah's expression grew more serious, more intense. I need you to understand something. I haven't been watching the news about you randomly, Valerie. I've been watching over you, deliberately, for some time now. The words made my skin prickle despite the blanket and the warming sensation returning to my limbs. Watching over me. Why would you? We've never even met. No, we haven't, he agreed. But I knew someone you loved very much. I owe you an explanation about your father. He paused, his eyes searching mine. About what really happened to your mother. Everything stopped. The sounds of the security team, the idling engines, the falling snow, all of it faded into background noise as those words detonated in my consciousness. My mother, who died 10 years ago when her car went off a mountain road. Brake failure, the police had said. Tragic accident. My father had never been the same after. What could Isaiah Ward possibly know about my mother? She died in a car accident. I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant and strange. 10 years ago, the brakes failed. Isaiah's expression told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. Something was wrong with that story. Something had been wrong with it all along, and I'd never known. Valerie, he began, but his security chief interrupted again this time with real urgency in his voice. Sir, we have possible movement in Sector 3. Unidentified vehicle approaching the perimeter. We need to evacuate immediately. The other men tensed hands, moving to weapons I hadn't realized they were carrying. The entire atmosphere shifted from rescue operation to combat readiness in the space of a heartbeat. Isaiah's jaw tightened with frustration, but he nodded. Then he looked at me with an expression that held both apology and determination. You saved the wrong man tonight, Valerie. The people who want me dead who did this to me, they won't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. Anyone who helped me. Anyone who can connect them to tonight. The implications crashed over me like ice water. I'd been seen with him. In this park. Giving him aid. If someone was watching, if someone was hunting him, they now knew about me too. You can't go back to that house. Isaiah said, his voice urgent now, as his team prepared to move. Not tonight. Not after being seen with me. Please, Valerie. Let me keep you safe until morning. Then I'll explain everything. Everything about your mother, about why I've been watching over you, about why tonight happened the way it did. I looked back in the direction of my family home, invisible through the falling snow, but there nonetheless. The home where my father had just thrown me out, where my sister had betrayed me, where I had no welcome and no safety. Then I looked at my bare feet, now covered in medical boots, but still frozen, still damaged from those minutes in the snow. I had nowhere to go, no one to call, no money, no phone, no resources. And if what Isaiah said was true, going back might put me in even more danger than I was already in. Please, Isaiah said again, and the genuine concern in his eyes made the decision for me. And then he made an offer that forced me to choose between fear and fate. Come with me. Isaiah said, his voice cutting through the chaos of his security team preparing for evacuation. "I have a private retreat in the mountains about 40 minutes from here. You'll be safe there while we figure out what's happening. I can get you medical attention, warm clothes, a place to rest." He paused, reading the hesitation on my face. "I know you have no reason to trust me, but Valerie, you truly cannot go back to that house tonight. Not just because of your family, but because of what you witnessed here. Please." The security chief was already guiding Isaiah toward the nearest SUV, supporting his weight with professional efficiency. Another man gestured for me to follow, his expression neutral, but his body language suggesting this wasn't a request so much as a necessary evacuation procedure. What choice did I have? My family home was closed to me. I had no money for a hotel, no phone to call what few friends I had, and my feet were damaged enough that walking anywhere was becoming impossible. Beyond all that, Isaiah's warning echoed in my mind. The people who tried to kill him might have seen me helping him, might consider me a witness who needed to be silenced. I nodded, and immediately 2 security personnel flanked me, guiding me toward a different SUV with the same careful urgency they'd shown with Isaiah. The vehicle's door opened, revealing an interior that looked more like a mobile command center than a car. Multiple screens glowed in the darkness, communication equipment lined the walls, and the seats were reinforced with materials I couldn't identify. They settled me in the back seat, wrapping additional thermal blankets around me and checking my vitals with portable medical equipment. A woman appeared. I hadn't noticed her among the tactical team earlier, and began treating my feet with careful professional movements. She didn't speak except to ask brief medical questions, her focus absolute. The convoy began moving, and I watched through tinted windows as we left the park. All 6 SUVs moved in coordinated formation, their positions shifting in what seemed like a complex pattern. The lead vehicle would drop back, another would move forward, then they'd rotate again. It took me several minutes to realize they were making it impossible for anyone to predict which vehicle contained Isaiah, which held me, which were decoys. This wasn't how normal, wealthy people traveled. This was something else entirely. The radio crackled with constant communication voices speaking in clipped, professional tones. Most of it was technical jargon I didn't understand, but certain phrases cut through with chilling clarity. "Alpha team, rotate to position 3. Confirm visual on primary vehicle. Signal interference detected at checkpoint 3. Running diagnostics now. Possible tail vehicle 2 miles back. Silver sedan, no plates visible. Monitoring. Counter-surveillance protocols in effect. All units maintain formation." My hands tightened on the thermal blanket. These weren't paranoid precautions or theatrical security theater. These men and women believed someone was actively hunting Isaiah right now, possibly tracking our convoy, looking for an opportunity to finish what they'd started. And I was caught in the middle of it. We made several stops along the route, pulling into parking lots or side roads where the security team would sweep the vehicles with electronic devices, checking for tracking equipment or listening devices. At one stop, I watched them remove something small from beneath one of the SUVs, a magnetic tracker I realized with growing horror. Someone had planted it, and recently. Through the tinted partition separating my section from the driver's area, I caught glimpses of the lead vehicle where I knew Isaiah was riding. Even in the darkness, I could see the silhouettes of his team clustered around him, their body language protective and alert. Whatever this man was involved in, whatever enemies he'd made his people were devoted to him with an intensity that went beyond employment. They'd die for him without hesitation. After about 30 minutes, the partition lowered slightly, and I found myself looking at Isaiah. He'd been cleaned up somewhat, his face no longer gray with hypothermia, though exhaustion still marked his features. Someone had given him dry clothes and proper medical attention. He looked more like the billionaire from magazine covers now, though the haunted expression in his eyes suggested tonight had changed something fundamental in him. "I want to thank you properly," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the engine noise and radio chatter. "Not with money, though. I'll ensure you're compensated for your medical expenses and losses. That's not what I mean by repayment." I waited, unsure what to say. "I've been investigating a financial fraud network for months. Isaiah continued, his tone shifting into something more businesslike despite the circumstances. A sophisticated operation that uses charitable organizations as fronts for money laundering. The people running it are dangerous connected and very good at hiding their tracks. He paused, studying my reaction. I believe your family's charity is part of that network. The words hit me like a slap. My family's charity, we run a small local fund. We help families with medical bills, heating costs in winter. We're not. I know what it appears to be, Isaiah interrupted gently. But appearances are exactly how these operations work. They find legitimate charities, usually small family-run ones, and infiltrate them. The people running the charity often have no idea what's really happening with their funds. His expression darkened. But someone in your family knows Valerie. Someone is complicit. My mind immediately went to Melanie, to her satisfied smile as she hugged our father after I'd been expelled. To Mark, who'd appeared with such convenient accusations. To my father's rage that seemed performative, directed at protecting something other than his moral outrage. I need someone on the inside, Isaiah said. Someone they won't suspect. Someone with access to family dynamics who can spot lies and inconsistencies the way only someone who knows these people intimately could. But most importantly, I need someone with a moral compass that can't be corrupted. His eyes held mine. I think you're that person, Valerie. Tonight proved it. You gave away your only protection to save a stranger's life. That kind of integrity is rare. The proposal was overwhelming, impossible to process in my current state. But I don't understand. What does this have to do with my mother, with why I was thrown out tonight? Everything, Isaiah said quietly. What happened to you tonight wasn't random, Valerie. It was orchestrated. You were removed from your family precisely because someone needed you out of the way. And your mother's death 10 years ago wasn't an accident. It was murder designed to silence her before she could expose the same network I'm investigating now. The vehicle suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. My mother. Murdered. The word didn't fit with the gentle woman who'd braided my hair and taught me about kindness, who died on a mountain road when her brakes failed. I'll explain everything, Isaiah promised, seeing my distress. But first we need to get you somewhere safe, somewhere warm. Then before dawn I'll show you documents that will make you understand exactly what you've been living through, exactly why your family treated you the way they did, and exactly what we're up against. And before dawn, I would learn the first ugly truth. The convoy turned off the main highway onto a road I wouldn't have noticed if I wasn't looking for it. No sign marked the turnoff, just a gap in the trees that could have been a logging trail or a private driveway. We climbed steadily, the vehicles navigating switchbacks with practiced ease, rising higher into the mountains until the scattered lights of civilization disappeared behind us. When the trees finally opened up, I saw it. The structure emerged from the mountainside itself, as if the building and the rock face had grown together over centuries. Massive windows glowed with warm light, but from certain angles the glass reflected the surrounding landscape so perfectly that whole sections of the building seemed to vanish. It was architectural artistry on a scale I'd only seen in magazines about homes I'd never be able to afford. The lead vehicle stopped before enormous doors that slid open silently, revealing an entrance carved from the mountain itself. We pulled into what could only be described as a private underground facility, complete with multiple vehicle bays, charging stations, and equipment I couldn't begin to identify. The doors sealed behind us with a pneumatic hiss that suggested we'd just entered a vault. Staff appeared immediately, moving with the same professional efficiency as the security team. They helped Isaiah from his vehicle first, and I watched through my window as they supported him with careful concern. He was walking under his own power now, though, clearly exhausted, his movements, those of someone operating on pure willpower. Then my door opened, and a woman in medical scrubs gestured for me to step out. Ms. Thomas, I'm Dr. Reeves. Let's get you inside and properly treated. Can you walk, or would you prefer a wheelchair? The fact that she knew my name shouldn't have surprised me at this point, But it did. "I can walk," I said, though in truth I wasn't certain. My feet felt like foreign objects attached to my legs, burning and numb simultaneously. She supported my weight as we moved through a series of corridors that belonged in a science fiction film. Retinal scanners guarded certain doorways. The walls seemed to be made of materials that absorbed sound, creating a strange, hushed quality to every footstep. At one point, we passed a room where dozens of monitors displayed what looked like financial data stock tickers, news feeds from around the world, all updating in real time. This wasn't just a home, it was a command center. Dr. Reeves brought me to a medical suite that rivaled any hospital I'd seen, equipped with imaging equipment and monitoring systems that hummed quietly. She worked on my feet with gentle precision, explaining that I'd narrowly avoided severe frostbite, but would need several days of careful treatment to ensure no permanent damage. While she worked, other staff brought warm clothes, expensive, perfectly sized, as if they'd known my measurements before I arrived, and hot tea that tasted like it cost more per cup than I made in an hour. Through the open doorway, I caught glimpses of other staff members passing by. They'd glance, in their expressions carefully neutral, but I felt the weight of their curiosity. Whispered conversations drifted down the hallway, just barely audible. "Is that her? The one from the park?" "Must be. He's never brought anyone here before. She doesn't look like much. Why her?" "There's a reason. There's always a reason with him." The words stung even though I understood them. I didn't belong here in this world of wealth and technology and people who moved through life with absolute certainty. I was a broke administrative assistant who'd been homeless 2 hours ago, who'd given away her boots to a stranger, and somehow ended up in a billionaire's mountain fortress, after Dr. Reeves finished training me and left me with strict instructions about keeping weight off my feet. For the next 24 hours, I sat alone in the medical suite, wrapped in clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent, drinking tea I couldn't pronounce the name of, feeling more lost than I had sitting on that frozen park bench. A soft knock interrupted my spiraling thoughts. The door opened to reveal Isaiah, cleaned up now and wearing casual clothes that somehow still managed to look expensive. His color had returned, though exhaustion still marked the lines around his eyes. "How are your feet?" he asked, his concern genuine. "They'll heal," I said. "Dr. Reeves says I was lucky." "Luck had nothing to do with it. You made a choice." He gestured to the doorway. "Can you walk? There's something I need to show you. If you'd prefer to rest first." "No," I interrupted. "I need answers more than I need rest." He nodded understanding and offered his arm for support. We moved slowly through corridors lined with original artwork pieces I recognized from museums, paintings that should have been behind velvet ropes and security glass. We passed rooms filled with technology libraries stacked with leather-bound books, windows that looked out over snow-covered peaks illuminated by moonlight. Finally, we reached a study that felt different from the rest of the facility, more personal. The walls were lined with books that looked read rather than decorative, their spines creased and worn. A massive desk dominated one end of the room, but Isaiah led me to a pair of leather chairs near a fireplace where flames danced behind glass. He settled into one chair, gesturing for me to take the other, and for a long moment he simply looked at me. The expression on his face made my skin prickle with awareness. This wasn't the look of someone meeting a stranger. This was recognition, familiarity, and something else I couldn't quite identify, grief maybe, or regret. Or, "You have her eyes," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then he seemed to realize he'd spoken aloud and cleared his throat. "Your mother, I mean. Margaret. She had the same eyes, the same way of looking at the world." My breath caught. "You knew my mother." "I did." His voice carried the weight of old memories. "She was a remarkable woman, Valerie. Stronger than she ever realized. Kinder than most people deserved. And far braver than anyone gave her credit for." The past tense, the emotion in his voice, it all suggested something deeper than casual acquaintance. "How did you know her?" "That's a longer story than we have time for tonight," Isaiah said. though something in his expression suggested it was a story that still caused him pain. "But you need to understand something important. I didn't bring you here just because you saved my life. That would have been reason enough, but it's not the whole truth." He leaned forward, his eyes holding mine with intensity that made it impossible to look away. "I brought you here because your life is tangled with mine in ways you don't understand yet. Ways that go back years to before your mother died, to decisions and choices that shaped both our futures without either of us knowing it." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "What happened to you tonight, being thrown out of your home, accused of theft, abandoned by your family? None of that was random. It was orchestrated deliberately by people who needed you out of the way." My hands tightened on the arms of the chair. "Out of the way of what?" Instead of answering, Isaiah stood and moved to his desk. He pulled out a file folder thick with papers, the tab marked Thomas Family Charity, along with dates spanning the last 15 years. When he returned and placed it in my lap, I saw my family's name typed across the top in official-looking letterhead. "Before we go any further," he said quietly, "you need to see this. You need to understand what your family has been involved in, what your sister has done, and why your mother's death wasn't the accident everyone believed it to be." He opened the folder to the first page, and I saw financial documents, bank statements, transaction records. My sister's signature appeared repeatedly, my father's name in several places. Numbers that made no sense, dates that triggered vague memories of family arguments I'd overheard but never understood. And the documents he showed me next made my knees go weak. The first document showed a bank statement from the Thomas Family Charitable Fund, an account I'd never known existed. The balance made my breath catch, over $200,000, far more than our small local charity should have been handling. We helped a few families each year with heating bills, medical expenses, maybe a holiday food drive. Where had this kind of money come from? Isaiah watched me absorb the information before turning to the next page. "Look at the signatures," he said gently. I did, and felt the floor tilt beneath me. Melanie's signature appeared at the bottom of transfer authorization forms, dozens of them. My sister's neat, careful handwriting, the same signature she'd practiced in high school, making the M elaborate and feminine, appeared again and again, approving transfers of $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 at a time. The dates spanned the last 3 years, a steady drumbeat of transactions that told a story I was only beginning to understand. "Keep reading," Isaiah urged. The next pages showed where the money went. Organizations with official-sounding names: Children's Future Foundation, Veterans Support Alliance, Medical Relief International. Each one received substantial donations from our family charity, sometimes multiple transfers in a single month. But something about the names felt wrong, too generic, too perfect. "These organizations don't exist," Isaiah said, answering the question forming in my mind. "They're shell companies, registered addresses that lead to empty storefronts or mailbox services. The money goes in, gets moved through a series of accounts across different countries, and comes out clean on the other side. That's money laundering, Valerie. And your sister's signature is on every transaction." My hands trembled as I turned more pages. Expense reports that claimed our small charity had paid $30,000 for administrative overhead when we'd never had an office. Donation records showing wealthy benefactors I'd never heard of contributing massive sums. Forms documenting purchases of medical supplies that were supposedly distributed to families in need, but with no record of which families received them or even proof the supplies existed. It was all fake. All of it. And Melanie had signed her name to the lies again and again. "This is why she framed you," Isaiah said quietly. "Federal investigators have been circling this charity for months. Someone tipped them off, probably a whistleblower from one of the connected organizations. Melanie knew it was only a matter of time before they came asking questions. She needed a scapegoat, someone to blame when the truth came out. And you were convenient." The word hit me like a slap. Convenient. That's all I'd ever been to my family: convenient labor, convenient blame, convenient to sacrifice when they needed protection. The missing $10,000 they'd accused me of stealing, That was probably just one transaction among dozens chosen specifically because it was recent and sizable enough to justify throwing me out. But I don't understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Melanie isn't sophisticated enough to organize something like this. She barely graduated high school. She can't even balance her own checkbook. How could she? She didn't, Isaiah interrupted. Your sister is a pawn, Valerie. Probably a willing pawn, but a pawn nonetheless. The man behind this operation is named Richard Hale. He pulled out another file, this one with newspaper clippings and photographs. The man in the photos was in his late 60s, distinguished-looking with silver hair, and the kind of face that radiated trustworthy authority. He appeared in images from charity galas, business conferences, political fundraisers. Everything about him screamed respectability. Hale has been doing this for 20 years, Isaiah explained, spreading the documents across the coffee table between us. He identifies small family-run charities that have good reputations in their communities but lack professional oversight. Then he approaches them with an offer that seems too good to be true, usually a promise of major donations or connections to wealthy benefactors. Once he's gained their trust, he gradually takes control of the finances. The charity becomes his personal money laundering operation, and by the time anyone realizes what's happening, it's too late. I stared at the photos of Richard Hale, trying to reconcile this respectable-looking businessman with the crimes Isaiah described. Why hasn't he been caught if he's been doing this for 20 years? Because he's careful, very careful. He chooses his targets well. People who are naive about finance, who are so grateful for the help that they don't ask hard questions. He keeps legitimate donations flowing through the charity so it looks active and successful. And he's very good at making himself disappear from the paper trail. Officially, he's just a generous donor and occasional advisor. The actual criminal signatures belong to people like your sister. The full picture crystallized in my mind with horrible clarity. Melanie had been manipulated into putting her name on documents she probably didn't understand, but she'd also benefited. I remembered her suddenly having money for new clothes, for trips, for things our family could never afford before. She'd known enough to enjoy the rewards while remaining willfully ignorant of the source. And when the consequences finally arrived, she'd thrown me to the wolves without hesitation. Isaiah let me sit with this knowledge for a long moment before speaking again. I need your help, Valerie, not just because I owe you for saving my life, but because you're uniquely positioned to gather evidence that I can't get any other way. What kind of evidence? The kind that comes from understanding family dynamics, from knowing when people are lying, from having access to conversations and situations that outsiders can never penetrate. He leaned forward, his expression intense. I have forensic accountants who can trace money. I have investigators who can surveil suspects. I have lawyers who can build cases. But I don't have someone who knows these people the way you do, who can spot the inconsistencies and lies that only a family member would recognize. The proposition hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. He was asking me to become an active participant in investigating my own family, to use my insider knowledge as a weapon against the people who'd raised me. And if I say yes, I asked, then I'll protect you, completely. You'll never be implicated in any of the fraud. I'll ensure you have legal representation, financial support, housing, anything you need. More than that, I'll help you get justice for what they did to you tonight. His eyes held mine. But I need you to understand something. This investigation will likely destroy your family's reputation. Your father will face consequences. Melanie will probably go to prison unless she cooperates with authorities. The life you knew, such as it was, will be over forever. The life I knew ended tonight when my father threw me out in the snow, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. They made their choice. Now I get to make mine. Isaiah nodded slowly, something like respect flickering across his face. There's one more thing you need to know. About your mother's death. About how all of this connects to what happened to her 10 years ago. He paused, and I saw him weighing his words carefully. But you're not ready to hear that yet. First, you need to rest, to heal, to process what you've already learned. When you're stronger, I'll tell you everything. Part of me wanted to demand answers immediately, but another part, the part that was exhausted and overwhelmed and still processing the betrayal of this Christmas Eve, knew he was right. I couldn't handle any more revelations tonight. But Isaiah didn't tell me everything yet. The first few days passed in a blur of medical treatments and exhausted sleep. Dr. Reeves visited twice daily to check my feet-changing dressings and monitoring for signs of infection or tissue death. She explained with clinical detachment that somehow made it more frightening that I'd been perhaps 30 minutes away from permanent nerve damage when Isaiah's team found us. The boots I'd given away had quite literally saved my ability to walk normally. "You're lucky," she said on the third day, examining my toes with careful precision. "Or incredibly resilient. Maybe both." I didn't feel lucky. I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped away everything I'd believed about my life and left only empty space behind. But as the days passed and my body healed, something unexpected began to fill that emptiness. Not bitterness, though I had plenty of that. Something else. Something that felt almost like purpose. Isaiah had given me a suite on the third floor, a series of rooms that included a bedroom larger than my entire previous apartment, a sitting area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains, and a bathroom with heated floors and a shower that had more settings than my old car. The closet had been stocked with clothes in my exact size, casual wear, professional attire, even workout gear, all expensive brands I recognized from window shopping I'd done in moments of fantasy. At first, the staff maintained careful distance. They were polite but cool, performing their duties with professional efficiency while clearly wondering what exactly I was doing there. I caught their glances when they thought I wasn't looking, heard the questions in their silence. Who was I? Why had their boss brought me here? How long would I be staying? But I wasn't content to simply recover in isolated luxury. On the fourth day, I asked if I could access Isaiah's library. On the fifth, I requested financial news channels in my room. By the sixth day, I'd begun attending the morning briefings Isaiah held with his investigative team, sitting quietly in the back and absorbing everything I could understand. That's when things began to shift. During one briefing, a forensic accountant named David was presenting analysis of the Thomas charity transactions, explaining patterns he'd identified in the money flow. I listened carefully, following the logic until he mentioned a large donation supposedly designated for a youth sports program. "Excuse me," I said, surprising myself with my own voice. The room went quiet, everyone turning to look at the woman who'd been silent in the corner for days. "That donation, the one for the sports program, it's dated March 15th, 3 years ago." David checked his notes. "That's correct. My father had back surgery in February that year. He was bedridden for 2 months, heavily medicated. There's no way he would have been coordinating a sports program during that time. He could barely get out of bed to use the bathroom." I paused, feeling their attention sharpen. "Which means someone else made that decision and forged his approval." The silence that followed was different from before. Isaiah leaned forward in his chair, a slight smile playing at his lips. David made rapid notes. The team's lead investigator, a woman named Sarah Chen, pulled up additional files on her tablet. "That's extremely helpful," Sarah said, her tone carrying genuine respect. "Can you think of any other periods when your father would have been physically or mentally incapable of making charity decisions?" I could. Over the next hour, I identified at least 7 transactions that couldn't possibly have been legitimate based on my knowledge of family circumstances, health issues, or simple logistics. The team listened with increasing interest, their initial wariness transforming into something that looked like professional appreciation. After the briefing, Isaiah pulled me aside. "You have an extraordinary memory for detail," he observed. "I spent 28 years trying to anticipate my family's needs," I replied. "You learn to notice everything when your value depends on being useful." His expression softened with understanding. "Your value never depended on that, Valerie. Your family just never bothered to see what was really there." Over the following days, I became a regular presence in the investigation team's work. They'd present evidence, and I'd provide context that no amount of financial forensics could uncover. When they found a donation record for winter coats, I pointed out my father's severe wool allergy. He'd never approve wool coats, which meant someone else had made that decision. When they questioned timing of certain transactions, I could recall family events, vacations, or crises that made the official story impossible. The team began to treat me differently, not as a charity case or someone's rescued pet project, but as a colleague. They asked my opinion. They invited me to strategy sessions. They listened when I spoke. It was a novel experience being valued for my intelligence rather than my willingness to sacrifice myself for others' convenience. One evening, Isaiah invited me back to his study. The fire was burning, casting warm light across the leather chairs, where we'd first looked at the damning documents about my family. "I want to explain something," he said, settling into his chair. "Why I need you for this investigation specifically." I waited, curious. "The law can punish criminals." He began, his tone thoughtful. "But it often fails to deliver real justice. People with money and connections find ways to minimize consequences, to shift blame, to emerge relatively unscathed while their victims suffer. I've seen it happen dozens of times." He pulled out another file, this one containing stories that made my chest tighten. An elderly woman who'd founded a small charity to honor her late husband, only to have Richard Hale drain every penny, leaving her destitute. A disabled veteran whose support services vanished overnight when the charity supposedly helping him collapsed under fraud allegations. A young mother who'd trusted her family's charitable foundation, never knowing her brother was using it to launder drug money until FBI agents arrived at her door. "These people did nothing wrong," Isaiah said quietly. "They were guilty only of trusting the wrong people, of believing in goodness when they should have suspected evil. The criminals in these cases got plea deals, reduced sentences, sometimes walked away entirely. But the victims? Their lives were destroyed." I looked at the files, at the faces of people who reminded me uncomfortably of myself. "I need you to be the moral center of this investigation," Isaiah continued. "Someone who remembers that behind every fraudulent transaction there's a family who needed help and didn't get it. Someone who can't be seduced by legal technicalities or convince themselves that a little corruption is acceptable. Someone who understands exactly what it costs to be betrayed by the people who should protect you." The responsibility of it settled over me like a weight, but not an unwelcome one. This wasn't just about revenge or vindication. It was about preventing other families from being destroyed the way mine had destroyed me. "I'll do it," I said, hearing the certainty in my own voice. "Officially, whatever you need." Isaiah nodded, respect clear in his expression. "Welcome to the team, Valerie." For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt something other than pain or confusion. I felt purposeful, needed, valued for qualities I'd always possessed but had never been encouraged to develop. But just when I started to feel safe, my father called. The call came during a morning briefing 2 weeks and 1 day after Christmas Eve. Isaiah's communications specialist, a quiet man named Marcus, entered the conference room and spoke directly to Isaiah in a low voice. Isaiah's expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Valerie," he said, turning to me, "your father has been trying to reach you. He's called the main line here 3 times this morning. He's asking to speak with you urgently." The room went silent. Everyone knew my story by now, how I'd been expelled from my home, falsely accused, thrown out to freeze on Christmas Eve. The team had treated the knowledge with professional discretion, never mentioning it unless relevant to the investigation. But I felt their attention shift to me now, careful and assessing. "Do you want to take the call?" Isaiah asked. "You're under no obligation. We can simply tell him you're unavailable." Part of me wanted exactly that, to let my father's calls go unanswered, to let him feel the same helplessness I'd felt standing on that porch in the snow. But another part, the part that still carried the trained reflexes of 28 years, felt the familiar pull of duty. "I'll take it," I said. "But I want it on speaker. I want witnesses to whatever he says." Isaiah nodded and gestured to Marcus, who set up the call through the room's conference system. A moment later, my father's voice filled the space, and I was unprepared for how it would affect me. He was crying, deep shuddering sobs that I'd only heard once before at my mother's funeral when he'd broken down at the graveside. The sound of it triggered something primal in me that instinct children have to comfort their parents to fix whatever's causing pain.
"Valerie," he choked out. "Oh God, Valerie, thank God you're alive. We've been so worried, so terribly worried."
Worried. The word rang hollow. 2 weeks had passed since he'd thrown me out, and not once had he tried to find me to check if I'd survived that freezing night to see if I needed help. His worry apparently had only manifested now that he needed something. "I'm fine," I said, keeping my voice level. "What do you want?" "Want?" He sounded genuinely wounded. "Valerie, sweetheart, I don't want anything. I'm calling because we need you. The family needs you. There's been a terrible misunderstanding with the charity federal investigators are asking questions, and everything is falling apart. Melanie is absolutely falling apart. My job is at risk. Everything we've built is in jeopardy." I noticed what he didn't say. No apology, no acknowledgement that he'd been wrong about me, no recognition that I'd been innocent all along. The accusations that had justified my exile were simply erased, replaced by this new crisis that required my attention. "What kind of questions are the investigators asking?" I asked, watching Isaiah's team take notes. "Financial questions, about the charity accounts, about donations and disbursements. They're implying there's been some kind of fraud, which is absolutely ridiculous. We run a small local charity, for God's sake. We help families in need, but they've frozen our accounts and they're demanding documentation we don't have. And Melanie signed a lot of papers she doesn't remember, and we need you to come home right now and help us sort this out." As he spoke, memories cascaded through my mind with painful clarity. I was 16 again, watching my father spend hours helping Melanie choose a dress for her school dance, while completely forgetting it was my birthday. I was 19, sitting in the financial aid office, being told I'd have to withdraw from college because my family couldn't contribute their expected share, while Melanie's private school tuition was never questioned or reduced. I was 23, working double shifts to help pay for my father's medical bills, while he praised Melanie for remembering to send him a get well card. The pattern had always been there. Valerie was the strong one, the responsible one, the one who could handle anything. Melanie was precious, fragile, needing protection and accommodation. I'd absorbed this dynamic so completely that I'd never questioned it, never realized I was being systematically devalued in favor of a sister who contributed nothing but took everything. "Why should I help?" I asked, and the question seemed to genuinely confuse him. "Because you're family," he said, as if this explained everything. "Because we need you. Because you've always been the smart one, the one who can figure things out. You're the only person who can help us through this." "Where was family when you threw me out on Christmas Eve?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended. "Where was family when you accused me of stealing money I'd never seen? Where was family when I was homeless and freezing?" "Valerie, we were upset. We made a mistake. But this is bigger than that argument. This is about protecting our family name, about keeping Melanie out of serious trouble." His voice shifted, becoming more urgent, more desperate. "She can't go to prison, Valerie. She's too fragile for that. She's not like you. She can't handle pressure the way you can. You've always been the strong one. You can weather this storm. But Melanie, it would destroy her." There it was. The truth laid bare without any awareness of how damning it sounded. He wasn't calling because he loved me, or because he regretted how he'd treated me, or because he wanted to make amends. He was calling because he needed me to sacrifice myself again one more time to protect the daughter he actually cared about. "You have to help protect your sister." He continued, his tears giving way to something more demanding. "You're the oldest. You have a responsibility. Whatever happened on Christmas Eve, we can work through that later. Right now, we need you to come home and tell these investigators that there's been a misunderstanding, that the charity finances are clean, that any irregularities are just administrative errors. You're good with details. You can explain things in a way that makes sense." He wanted me to lie, to cover up fraud, to put myself at risk of criminal prosecution to shield Melanie from the consequences of her own actions. And he genuinely seemed to believe this was a reasonable request, that my role in the family entitled him to demand my self-destruction. Across the table, Isaiah watched me with steady attention. I saw understanding in his eyes and something else, permission to choose differently this time. "No," I said quietly. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. "What?" "No, I'm not coming home. I'm not helping you cover this up. Melanie signed those documents. She benefited from whatever money came through that charity. She threw me out to protect herself. She made her choices, and now she gets to live with the consequences. Valerie Ann Thomas, you listen to me." My father's voice rose with the particular tone he'd always used when demanding obedience. I hung up. My hand was shaking as I pulled it away from the conference phone. The room remained silent, my father's disconnected voice replaced by the quiet hum of electronics and the sound of my own rapid breathing. Isaiah spoke first, his voice gentle but firm. "Love that demands your destruction isn't love at all, Valerie. It's exploitation wearing love's mask." Something shifted inside me in that moment, like a boundary wall constructing itself where there had only been open, vulnerable space before. All my life I'd believed that being good meant being useful, that love required endless sacrifice, that family loyalty meant accepting whatever treatment they deemed appropriate. I'd been wrong. That was the moment I felt the first spark of revenge. The spark didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger over the following days as I immersed myself in the investigation with renewed purpose. My father's call had clarified something essential. I owed these people nothing. No loyalty, no protection, no sacrifice. Whatever happened to them would be a consequence of their own choices, not my betrayal. Sarah Chen set me up with access to the complete financial database the team had compiled over months of investigation. Hundreds of transactions, thousands of documents, all cross-referenced and tagged with forensic precision. I started working through them methodically, looking for patterns that numbers alone wouldn't reveal. That's when I began to see Richard Hale's fingerprints everywhere. The name appeared subtly at first, a consulting firm he owned that had provided strategic advice to the Thomas Charity 3 years ago. Then a series of donations from organizations he was connected to, each one large enough to seem significant, but not so large as to trigger automatic oversight. The money always came with conditions, suggestions for how it should be distributed, recommendations for vendors who could provide services. David, one of the forensic accountants, joined me in the conference room where I'd spread out printed documents across the massive table. "You're seeing it, aren't you?" he said, pointing to the web of connections I'd been mapping. "The way he works. It's like watching a spider build a web one thread at a time." "How does he get away with it?" I asked. "If this pattern is so clear—" "Because he never gets his own hands dirty," David interrupted. "Look at the signatures on all these documents. Hale's name appears as a donor, an advisor, a concerned community member. But the actual fraud, that's committed by the charity's own people. Your sister signed these transfer authorizations. Your father approved these expense reports. Technically, Hale is just a generous businessman who gave money to a corrupt charity. Proving he orchestrated the fraud requires evidence we've been building for months." Sarah joined us, tablet in hand. "He's been investigated 4 times in the past 20 years, she explained, pulling up files. Twice by the FBI, once by IRS, once by state authorities in Connecticut. Every time the case fell apart because the people actually committing the fraud either refused to testify against him or claimed they'd acted independently. His lawyers are among the best in the country, and he has political connections that make prosecutors very cautious about bringing charges." "So why target small family charities?" I asked. "If he has all this power and these connections, why go after people like my family?" Because small charities are perfect for what he needs, David said. They have good reputations in their communities, so donations don't raise suspicion. They lack sophisticated oversight, so irregularities take longer to detect. And the founders are usually ordinary people without legal expertise or resources to fight back. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, the damage is done, and Hale has moved on to his next target. I turned back to the documents following the money trail with growing understanding. The Thomas charity had been perfect for Hale's purposes, small, trusted, run by people who were financially naive and eager for help. All he'd needed was a way to access our operations to insert himself into our decision-making without raising alarms. And that's when I found the consulting fee payments. The line item appeared innocuous at first: professional services, M. Anderson Strategic Consulting. $5,000. I flipped to the next month. Another payment, same amount. Then the month after that. I started pulling up every transaction tagged with Anderson's name, my hands moving faster as the implications crystallized. Mark Anderson. My ex-boyfriend. The payments spanned 3 years, always listed as consulting fees totaling over $75,000. I cross-referenced the dates with my own memories, and my stomach turned. The first payment was dated exactly 2 weeks before Mark had first spoken to me at that coffee shop where we'd randomly met. Where he'd been so charming, so interested in my work, so eager to hear about my family. "Oh my God," I whispered. Sarah looked up. "What did you find?" I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the screen at Mark's name appearing over and over at the money he'd received for 3 years of lying to me, pretending to care about me infiltrating my family's trust. Sarah pulled up additional files, her expression darkening as she read. Mark Anderson appears in 3 other cases we've investigated connected to Hale. Different charities, different cities. Same pattern: he befriends someone in the family, gains access to the organization's operations, facilitates Hale's control. He's not just an accomplice. He's a professional. The room tilted. My relationship with Mark, the 8 months we'd dated, the tender moments I'd treasured, all of it, had been a performance. A job. He'd been paid to seduce me to meet my family, to earn their trust. Every kiss had been calculated. Every word of affection had been scripted. And when I'd broken up with him because something felt wrong, because some instinct had warned me he wasn't genuine, he'd simply pivoted to Melanie. "He started dating my sister after we broke up," I said, my voice hollow. "That's how Melanie got involved in all this. Mark brought her in, made her trust him, convinced her to sign documents she didn't understand." Isaiah entered the room, drawn by the sudden tension. He took one look at my face, and the documents spread across the table, and understanding crossed his features. "You found Mark Anderson," he said quietly. "I dated him," I replied. "For 8 months 2 years ago. He met my family, had dinner at our house, played the perfect boyfriend, and he was being paid the entire time to spy on us." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry, Valerie. I should have told you earlier that he was connected to Hale. I wanted you to discover it naturally through the investigation rather than having me tell you. But I didn't consider how much it would hurt." The betrayal cut deeper than my family's. Mark had looked into my eyes and told me he loved me. He'd held me when I cried about my mother. He'd promised we had a future together. And all of it, every single moment, had been purchased by Richard Hale for $5,000 a month. "There's something else you need to see," Isaiah said, pulling up a different file. Hale's background. His history with me. The file contained newspaper articles from 20 years ago, business journals chronicling a bitter rivalry between 2 emerging tech security companies. Isaiah's company, Secure Core, and Hale's company, Sentinel Systems. The competition had been fierce, sometimes crossing ethical lines. "Hale tried to destroy me through corporate espionage," Isaiah explained. "He planted people in my company, stole proprietary information, attempted to sabotage major contracts. I survived, but barely. The legal battle bankrupted him, forced him out of the tech industry entirely. He disappeared for a few years, and when he resurfaced, he'd pivoted to this financial fraud through charitable organizations." "But what does that have to do with my family?"
I asked. Isaiah's expression grew heavy with old grief. The fact that Hale targeted your family's charity specifically out of thousands of small charities he could have chosen isn't coincidence. He knew it would hurt someone I cared about, someone I'd made a promise to protect. The past tense again, the weight of something unsaid. I pressed him. Who did you promise to protect? Not yet, Isaiah said, though I could see the answer cost him. You're not ready for that truth yet. Soon, but not yet. But nothing prepared me for the next name on the list. I spent the next several days digging deeper into the financial records, each discovery adding another layer to my understanding of how thoroughly I'd been deceived. Mark's name appeared in contexts that made my skin crawl, attending family dinners not out of affection, but to observe our vulnerabilities, offering to help with charity paperwork to gain access to sensitive documents, suggesting Melanie get more involved with the organization to position her as the perfect fall guy. But it was while searching through older records documents from 3 years ago, when the fraud first began, that I found something that made everything else pale in comparison. A signature authorization form for opening offshore bank accounts in the charity's name. The accounts that had been used for the most suspicious transfers, the ones that moved money through Caribbean banks and European shell companies before bringing it back clean. Someone with legal authority over the charity had to approve opening those accounts. The signature at the bottom read, T. Thomas, in my father's distinctive scrawl. I stared at the document for a long time, my vision blurring as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The date was 3 years and 2 months ago, right at the beginning of the fraud trail. This wasn't my father being fooled by Hale or manipulated by Melanie. This was my father actively, knowingly opening the door to money laundering. I pulled up more documents with shaking hands. Administrative fee payments to T. Thomas Consulting Services, a company I'd never heard of that investigation showed existed only on paper as a pass-through for Hale's payments. Over 36 months, my father had received nearly $50,000 in fees for his cooperation. He'd sold out his own charity, his own family's reputation for less than $1,700 a month. The nausea hit me in waves. This was the man who'd lectured me about responsibility and integrity my entire life. The man who'd thrown me out on Christmas Eve for supposedly stealing money when he'd been stealing far more for far longer. The man who'd called me desperate and crying just days ago, begging me to come home and help, knowing full well that he was the one who'd enabled everything. I don't know how long I sat there staring at his signature before Isaiah found me. I heard the door open, heard his footsteps approach, but couldn't bring myself to look up. You found his signature, Isaiah said quietly. It wasn't a question. The tears came then, hot and bitter. Not tears of sadness, but of rage, of betrayal so profound it felt like my entire foundation had crumbled. Everything I'd believed about my father, about my family, about my place in the world, all of it was built on lies. Isaiah sat down beside me, not touching, just present. He waited until my breathing steadied before speaking. Good people are often victimized by their own families, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Do you know why? I shook my head, not trusting my voice. Because kindness is seen as weakness, and weakness is seen as something to exploit. Your father made you believe your value came from your usefulness to him, how much you could sacrifice, how much burden you could carry, how much pain you could endure without complaint. He trained you to accept less than you deserved, by convincing you that you didn't deserve better. The words cut through my fog of emotion with surgical precision. That's exactly what had happened. My entire childhood had been a systematic devaluation of my worth, a conditioning process that made me believe love required endless sacrifice while offering nothing in return. But now you're free, Isaiah continued. Free to discover your real worth, free to set boundaries, free to demand that people earn your loyalty rather than simply expect it because of blood relation. He paused. Your father is corrupt, Valerie, not just financially, but morally, and you owe him nothing. I wiped my eyes, feeling something crystallize inside me. Isaiah was right. I'd spent 28 years trying to earn love from someone fundamentally incapable of giving it, someone who saw me only as a resource to be used until I was depleted. "There's something else you need to see," Isaiah said after a moment. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a file I hadn't seen before. The tab read, "Margaret Thomas, 2010, in neat typeface. My mother's name. The year she died." My hand moved toward it automatically, but Isaiah held it back, his expression serious. "Before I show you this, I need you to understand something. What's in this file will change everything you think you know about your mother's death. It will be painful, infuriating, and possibly dangerous knowledge to possess. Are you sure you're ready?" "I need to know," I whispered. "Not yet," he said, and I saw genuine concern in his eyes. "Not like this when you're already processing your father's betrayal. There's something you need to know about your mother's car accident, about how she really died. But first, you need to be strong enough to hear it without breaking." He held the file so I could see the edge of a document inside. A name jumped out at me in bold text, Richard Hale. And beside it in red ink a single word, "resolved," with a red X drawn through it. My blood turned to ice. Resolved, like a problem that had been dealt with, like a threat that had been eliminated. Was my mother's death not an accident? The question came out barely audible. Isaiah's expression was answer enough, but he said it anyway. "No, Valerie, it wasn't. But before I explain how and why we need to finish building the case against Hale, we need to be ready to protect you from what comes after you know the truth. The investigation into Hale comes first. Then I'll tell you everything about your mother, I promise." He closed the file and locked it back in the drawer, but the image of that document was burned into my mind. Richard Hale. Resolved. My mother hadn't died in a random accident. She'd been killed. Murdered. And somehow, Hale was connected. The room felt too small, the air too thin. My father was corrupt. My mother was murdered. My entire life had been built on lies and violence and manipulation I'd never suspected. Then a message arrived from my sister. Marcus appeared in the doorway of the conference room where I'd been sitting with Isaiah, still processing the revelation about my father's complicity and the hints about my mother's death. His expression was carefully neutral, but something in his posture suggested he was delivering news he knew would complicate an already difficult situation. "Ms. Thomas, you have a message on the secure line we set up for you. It's from your sister Melanie. She's been trying to reach you through multiple channels. This one came through your old email account, which we've been monitoring per your authorization." Isaiah looked at me, raising an eyebrow in silent question. Did I want to see it? I nodded, and Marcus pulled up the message on the conference room's main screen. The text was long, filling multiple paragraphs, and as I started reading, I could almost hear Melanie's voice in the carefully chosen words. "Valerie, please, I'm begging you. I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but I need you to come home. The family needs you." Federal investigators showed up at the house 3 days ago with questions about the charity, about transactions I supposedly approved, about money I supposedly moved to offshore accounts. They're talking about criminal prosecution. They're saying I could go to prison for fraud and money laundering. Valerie, I'm terrified. They manipulated me. Richard Hale and Mark Anderson, they manipulated all of us. Mark told me he loved me. He said he was helping the charity grow, that the paperwork was just formalities. Dad said everything was fine, that I was doing great work. I didn't know what I was signing. I trusted them, and they used me. And now everything is falling apart, and I don't know what to do. You're the smart one. You always knew how to fix things. Please come home and help me explain to these people that I didn't mean to do anything wrong. I need my sister. I need you." The message went on, variations on the same theme carefully crafted to elicit maximum sympathy while avoiding any actual admission of criminal intent. I recognized the phrasing immediately. This had been reviewed, probably written or heavily edited by a lawyer.
Every sentence was designed to establish Melanie as a victim while creating plausible deniability about her knowledge and intent. But despite my cynicism, despite knowing I was being manipulated, I felt something twist in my chest. Because underneath the calculated language, I could hear echoes of the little sister I'd once known. The girl who used to follow me around the house when she was 5 and I was 8, wanting to do everything I did. The child who'd cry until I braided her hair before school because she said I did it better than anyone else. The teenager who'd come to my room after fights with our father seeking comfort, even as she never defended me during those same fights. When had that girl become this woman who'd throw me to federal investigators to save herself? I knew the answer. It had happened gradually, systematically, over years of watching our father reward her for helplessness and punish me for strength. Melanie had learned that tears got her what she wanted, that playing fragile and confused earned protection and forgiveness. That responsibility was something other people, specifically me, carried, so she didn't have to. Our father had created this dynamic training both of us for our roles. I was the workhorse, the problem solver, the one who sacrificed. Melanie was the princess, the protected one, the one whose mistakes were always someone else's fault. And both of us had suffered for it, just in different ways. I thought about the times I'd defended her against school bullies, even when she'd provoked them. The hours I'd spent helping her with homework she'd ignored until the last minute. The lies I'd covered for the messes I'd cleaned up, the consequences I'd absorbed on her behalf. I'd done it all believing this was what sisters did, what family meant. But family should have been reciprocal. And Melanie had never, not once, protected me the same way. Isaiah had been reading the message over my shoulder. Now he spoke quietly, his tone thoughtful rather than judgmental. "Your sister isn't asking for help," he observed. "She's asking for a shield. She wants you to take responsibility to protect her the way you always have, to sacrifice yourself one more time so she can escape consequences." The words struck home because they were exactly right. Nothing in Melanie's message suggested she wanted to face the truth, to cooperate with investigators, to take responsibility for the documents she'd signed. She wanted me to make it all go away the way I'd always made things go away. "Here's what's different now," Isaiah continued, turning to face me fully. "You get to choose. For the first time in your life, you have real power in this relationship. You can save yourself, or you can save her. But Valerie, you can't do both. If you go back and try to protect her, you'll be implicating yourself in the fraud. You'll be obstructing a federal investigation. You'll be throwing away everything we've built here, all the evidence we've gathered, all the progress toward actual justice." I stared at the message, at my sister's carefully crafted plea for help that was really a demand for protection. "Your kindness has always been your defining trait," Isaiah said. "It's one of the things that makes you remarkable. But kindness without boundaries isn't virtue, it's self-destruction. There's a difference between helping someone grow and enabling them to avoid growth, between supporting someone through hard times and shielding them from the natural consequences of their choices." He was right. I'd spent my entire life being kind to people who interpreted kindness as weakness, who saw my willingness to sacrifice as permission to take. And what had it earned me? Homelessness on Christmas Eve. False accusations. A family that valued me only for what I could provide. Melanie's message was one more request for sacrifice dressed up in the language of sisterhood and family loyalty. But real sisters protected each other. Real families didn't throw you out in the snow and then demand you come back when they needed a human shield. I thought about the girl who'd followed me around at age 5, and I felt genuine grief for what she'd become. But grief didn't obligate me to destroy myself, saving her from herself. "I need to see her," I said finally, "face to face, but not to give her what she wants." Isaiah nodded slowly. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time she learned the same lesson I did." I looked at him steadily. "That choices have consequences. That kindness has limits. And that family is something you build through actions, not something you can demand because of blood." I decided it was time to face my sister, but not in the way she expected. The drive back to my hometown took less than an hour,
but it felt like crossing into a different lifetime. Isaiah had insisted on sending me with a security detail, 2 professionals in a separate vehicle maintaining distance, but staying close enough to intervene if necessary. He'd also insisted I take copies of key documents carefully selected to prove fraud, without revealing the full scope of our investigation. "Show them you know," he'd advised, "but don't show them everything you know. Not yet." I dressed carefully that morning, choosing clothes from the wardrobe Isaiah had provided: a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than I used to make in a month, leather shoes that actually fit properly, a silk blouse in deep burgundy. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because of the expensive clothes, but because of the expression on my face. Calm. Certain. Powerful. The charity office was located in a small building downtown, sandwiched between a coffee shop and an accounting firm. I'd been here dozens of times over the years, usually to drop off donations or help with filing. The familiar brick exterior looked exactly the same, but I felt completely different walking through the door. The receptionist looked up from her desk and did an actual double take. Her mouth opened slightly, confusion flickering across her face as she tried to reconcile the woman in front of her with the person she remembered. I could see the questions forming. Where had I been? What had happened? Why did I look like I'd just walked out of a corporate boardroom? "Hello, Diane," I said calmly. "I'm here to see my father and sister." Yes, of course. They're in the conference room. Let me just..." But before she could finish, Melanie burst through the conference room door. She must have been watching for me, waiting for my arrival. Her face was blotchy from crying, or from the careful application of techniques designed to look like crying. She rushed forward with arms outstretched, theatrical emotion radiating from every gesture. "Valerie, oh my God, Valerie, you came? I was so worried we didn't know where you were. Thank God you're okay." She threw her arms around me in a dramatic embrace, pressing her face against my shoulder. I stood perfectly still, arms at my sides, not returning the hug. After a moment, she pulled back slightly, her performance faltering when she realized I wasn't responding as expected. "Valerie," her voice carried a hint of uncertainty now. "Aren't you glad to see me?" "Hello, Melanie." My tone was polite but neutral, the voice I'd use with a stranger I had no particular interest in knowing better. She blinked, thrown off balance, but quickly recovered her composure. She took my hand. I didn't pull away, but I didn't squeeze back either, and began leading me toward the conference room, words tumbling out in a rehearsed rush. "You have to help me, Val. You have to help us. These federal investigators, they're saying terrible things, making accusations that aren't true. I'm being destroyed by lies." Her voice broke on the last word, tears appearing on cue. "Richard Hale and Mark Anderson, they took advantage of us. They manipulated the charity, and now they're trying to make it look like I was involved, like I knew what they were doing. But I didn't know, Valerie. I swear I didn't know." I let her talk, watching the performance with clinical detachment. She was good at this. Years of practice had made her very good at playing the victim, at summoning tears and helplessness exactly when needed. But I could see the calculation behind it now, the way she carefully avoided any real admission of guilt while positioning herself as someone who'd been deceived. "You're the only one who can help," she continued, gripping my hands tighter. "You're smart. You're honest. Everyone respects you. If you vouch for me, if you tell the investigators that I was tricked, they'll believe you. They'll understand I was just trying to help the charity and these men took advantage of that." There it was. She wanted to use my reputation for honesty to shield her dishonesty. She wanted me to lie for her to tell federal investigators that she was too naive and innocent to have known what she was signing, all while benefiting from my credibility. The brazenness of it was almost impressive. Before I could respond, my father entered from the back office. He stopped when he saw me, his expression shifting through several emotions too quickly to identify. Then his face settled into something between annoyance and relief, the exact expression he'd always worn when I'd returned from running an errand he'd demanded I handle. "Where have you been?" The words came out sharp, accusatory. "We've been trying to reach you for weeks. Do you have any idea what's been happening here?" This is getting worse every day and you're off God knows where, impossible to contact. No greeting. No acknowledgement that I'd been thrown out. No recognition that the last time we'd spoken, he'd accused me of theft and ordered me out of his house in the snow. Just immediate criticism, making my absence the problem rather than addressing why I'd been absent. "You're the oldest, Valerie," he continued, his voice taking on that familiar tone of disappointed authority. "You have a responsibility to this family. Everything is falling apart, the charity, our reputation, Melanie's future, and you need to fix it. That's what the oldest child does. You fix things." The entitlement in his voice was staggering. After everything he'd done, everything he'd allowed to happen, he genuinely believed he had the right to demand I solve problems he'd helped create. He believed his role was to create messes, and mine was to clean them up, and that this arrangement was natural and right. I let him finish. Let him exhaust his prepared speech about responsibility and family and fixing things. I stood there calmly, my leather portfolio tucked under my arm, my expression neutral and controlled. The silence that followed his demands was profound. Diane had retreated to her desk, trying to look busy while clearly listening to every word. Melanie stood beside me, her tear-stained face watching me with growing uncertainty. My father stood near his office door, arms crossed, waiting for my compliance. I walked to the conference table and set down my portfolio. The leather made a soft sound against the wood, and I noticed my hands were steady. No trembling, no nervousness, just calm certainty about what I was about to do. "Let me show you something," I said quietly, opening the portfolio to reveal neatly organized documents inside. That's when I decided to show them the documents Isaiah gave me. I pulled the first set of documents from the portfolio and arranged them across the conference table with deliberate care. Bank statements, transfer authorizations, offshore account registrations. Each page positioned to tell its part of a larger story, like pieces of a puzzle that would form an undeniable picture once assembled. Melanie moved closer, her tears forgotten as curiosity overtook performance. My father stayed near the door, his expression wary but trying to maintain an air of authority, as if whatever I was showing them couldn't possibly be significant. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked, his tone dismissive. "Evidence," I said simply, "of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Please look closely. I think you'll find it illuminating." Melanie reached for the nearest document, and I watched her face as she began to read. Confusion came first, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of the banking codes and transaction details. Then recognition as she saw her own name, her own signature reproduced in clear digital copies. Then shock as the implications began to penetrate. My father joined her at the table, picking up page after page, his movements becoming more agitated with each one. I saw the moment understanding hit him, the way his face paled, the way his hands began to shake slightly. Not with shame or remorse, but with fear. "Where did you get these?" His voice had lost its authoritative edge, replaced by something thin and desperate. "That's not important," I replied. "What's important is what they prove. Offshore accounts opened in the charity's name registered to Melanie. Electronic signatures authorizing transfers of hundreds of thousands of dollars to shell companies and fake organizations. A clear pattern of money laundering spanning 3 years. I pulled out another document, this one with my father's signature prominently displayed. "And here your authorization to open those offshore accounts. Your approval of administrative fees that went directly to a consulting company you created. You weren't fooled by Richard Hale, Dad. You were complicit from the beginning." Melanie was crying again, but these weren't the controlled, theatrical tears from earlier. These were the tears of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse. "I didn't know what I was signing," she whispered. "Mark said they were just routine paperwork, that I was helping the charity operate more efficiently. I trusted him." "Did you—" I pulled another document from the portfolio, one I'd specifically selected for this moment. "Then explain this." I placed it in front of her a transfer authorization for $25,000 from the charity's main account directly to Melanie's personal checking account. The transaction was labeled as emergency family loan, but there was no record of repayment, no loan agreement, no justification whatsoever. The date, I said quietly, pointing to the top of the form. December 21st, 3 days before Christmas Eve, 3 days before you accused me of stealing and convinced Dad to throw me out. Melanie's face went absolutely white. She stared at the document as if it might burst into flames, her mouth opening and closing without sound. You weren't manipulated. I continued, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. You stole from the charity, $25,000 that was supposed to help families in need, and when you realized investigators were starting to ask questions, when you knew the fraud was about to be exposed, you framed me. You created a story about me stealing $10,000 to distract from the fact that you'd stolen more than twice that amount. That's not I can explain. But she couldn't. There was no explanation that would make this acceptable, no manipulation story that would account for money transferred directly to her personal account. My father's fist slammed down on the table with enough force to make the documents jump. Enough! This is enough! His face had gone red, veins standing out on his forehead, but his anger wasn't directed at himself or Melanie. It was directed at me. Do you have any idea what you're doing? He shouted. You're destroying this family, your own blood. Whatever mistakes were made, whatever happened with the charity, we could have handled it privately, kept it within the family. But instead, you're what gathering evidence, building a case against your own father and sister. I'm documenting crimes, I said calmly. There's a difference. You're betraying us. The words exploded from him, spittle flying. After everything we've done for you, after we raised you, clothed you, fed you, this is how you repay us. By trying to destroy the family name. The sheer narcissism of it was breathtaking. He genuinely believed he was the victim here, that my refusal to help cover up fraud was somehow a betrayal worse than the actual fraud itself. If you'd just come home when we called, he continued, his voice rising to a near roar, if you'd just answered the phone instead of hiding, God knows where we could have covered this up before investigators got involved. We could have moved some money around, created some documentation, made everything look legitimate. But no, you had to disappear, had to make yourself unreachable, had to let this whole situation spiral out of control. The admission hung in the air, shocking in its complete lack of self-awareness. He wanted me back, not to make things right, but to help conceal crimes. He was angry not because fraud had occurred, but because I hadn't helped hide it fast enough. In his mind, my duty as the oldest daughter was to facilitate whatever cover-up the family required, and my failure to do so was a greater sin than the original crimes. You don't get it, do you? I said quietly. This isn't about family loyalty or keeping secrets. This is about accountability, about facing consequences for choices you made. Consequences. My father's laugh was bitter and harsh. You want to talk about consequences? The consequence of what you're doing right now is that your sister goes to prison. That I lose my job, my reputation, everything I've built. That the Thomas name becomes synonymous with scandal in this community. Those are the consequences of your actions, Valerie. He still didn't understand. After everything, after all the evidence spread across the table documenting years of fraud, he still couldn't grasp that the consequences came from the crimes, not from exposing them. He'd spent so long avoiding accountability, manipulating situations to protect himself, that he genuinely couldn't conceive of a world where actions had natural consequences that couldn't be talked away or covered up. Melanie had sunk into a chair, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. But even in her breakdown, I noticed she wasn't apologizing, wasn't acknowledging what she'd done to me. She was just afraid of what would happen to her. And that was the moment I realized they feared the truth more than prison. I left the charity office without another word, walking past my father's continued protests and Melanie's sobbing. The security detail that had been waiting outside fell into step beside me. As I reached the car, their presence suddenly feeling less like precaution and more like necessity. The drive back to Isaiah's compound felt longer than the drive down every mile, weighted with the images of my father's rage and Melanie's fear. They hadn't shown remorse. They'd shown terror at being caught, anger at being exposed, but not a shred of genuine regret for what they'd done. The realization sat heavy in my chest. I'd barely entered the compound when Isaiah appeared, his expression grave in a way I'd learned meant serious trouble. He gestured for me to follow him to his private office, not the conference room where we usually worked. The distinction felt ominous. "We have a problem," he said as soon as the door closed behind us. "My security team detected surveillance during your visit to the charity office. Professional-grade equipment, multiple observers, coordinated coverage. Richard Hale's people were watching you." The words hit me like cold water. "How do you know it was Hale?" "Because we've been tracking his surveillance teams for months. We recognize their vehicles, their patterns." Isaiah pulled up images on his computer, photos of cars, people with cameras, equipment I didn't recognize. "They documented your entire visit. They know you're investigating, and more importantly, they know you're working with me." Fear spiked through my system, sharp and electric. This wasn't theoretical danger anymore. This wasn't about financial fraud that would be resolved in courtrooms with lawyers and judges. This was about someone actively monitoring me, someone who tried to kill Isaiah and might now consider me a target. "You're in danger, Valerie," Isaiah said flatly. "Hale doesn't leave loose ends. If he thinks you can testify against him, if he believes you have evidence that could put him in prison, you become a problem that needs to be eliminated. I need you to stay here in the compound where my security can protect you fully." Part of me wanted to accept immediately, to retreat into the safety of Isaiah's fortress and let professionals handle the danger. But another part, the part that had been growing stronger over these weeks, refused to run. "I'm not hiding," I heard myself say. "I'm too close to the truth now. If I disappear, if I stop investigating, Hale wins, and my mother's death goes unavenged." Isaiah looked at me with an expression that mixed concern with something like respect. "All right, but we increase security protocols. You don't go anywhere without a full team. Understood?" I nodded, and he seemed satisfied. He turned back to his computer, pulling up new files that made my pulse quicken with their implications. "We've had a breakthrough with Mark Anderson," Isaiah said. "My investigators traced his financial history back to his 18th birthday, and we found something significant." The screen showed bank records, trust fund distributions, payments that had been flowing to Mark for over a decade. The amounts were substantial enough to fund a comfortable lifestyle, to pay for education and travel, to ensure he never needed conventional employment. "This trust fund is administered by Richard Hale," Isaiah continued. "The money comes from offshore accounts connected to Hale's various business entities. But the interesting part is why Hale would be paying Mark this kind of money for so long." He pulled up another document, legal records that had been sealed, requiring specialized access to retrieve. Birth certificates with redacted information, court filings from decades ago that referenced paternity disputes and confidential settlements. "Mark Anderson is Richard Hale's illegitimate son," Isaiah said quietly. "Born to a woman Hale had an affair with 30 years ago. Hale paid to keep the birth quiet to protect his marriage and political ambitions. He's been supporting Mark financially ever since, but kept the relationship completely hidden from public record." The revelation made me dizzy. Mark wasn't just an accomplice or an employee. He was Hale's son, raised from birth to be useful to his father's criminal enterprise. Every moment of our relationship had been orchestrated not just by someone paid to deceive me, but by someone genetically connected to the man who'd destroyed my family. "But here's what you need to understand." Isaiah continued, his voice taking on an edge of anger I rarely heard from him. "Mark didn't choose to target your family randomly. Hale sent him specifically to monitor the Thomases 3 years ago. He was establishing groundwork to use your charity as a money laundering front. But why your family? Why that specific charity out of thousands he could have chosen?" He pulled out a document I recognized, part of the file marked with my mother's name. The one he'd shown me briefly before, the one that had revealed Richard Hale's involvement in whatever had really happened to her. "Because Hale knew your mother once,"
Isaiah said, his eyes holding mine. 15 years ago, Margaret Thomas discovered that Richard Hale was running a fraud operation through another charity she volunteered with. She gathered evidence. She was preparing to go to authorities, and she threatened to expose him. The room seemed to tilt. My mother knew Hale had confronted him. "Your mother's car accident wasn't an accident, Valerie. Her brakes were tampered with. Hale had her killed to silence her before she could testify. And then years later, when he decided to restart his operation in this area, he specifically targeted your family's charity. It was revenge, punishment. A way of proving that even beyond death, he could destroy what Margaret Thomas had built." My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against Isaiah's desk, trying to ground myself in something solid. "You're saying he killed my mother, then waited over a decade to destroy her family?" "I'm saying you were targeted from the beginning because you're Margaret Thomas's daughter. Mark was sent to infiltrate your family to ensure none of you ever suspected the truth about your mother's death and to position your charity for exploitation. Everything that's happened to you, the false accusations, the exile, the fraud, all of it stems from the fact that your mother had the courage to stand up to a monster." Then Isaiah said something I never expected. "Richard Hale wants to meet you." The words hung in the air between us, impossible and yet somehow inevitable. Of course Hale wanted to meet me. He'd killed my mother, destroyed my family, and now I was threatening to expose everything. He would want to assess me, intimidate me, or eliminate me. "He sent the invitation through his attorney," Isaiah continued, pulling up an email on his screen. "Very formal, very careful. A dinner meeting at Marcello's, that high-end Italian place downtown. He's offering to discuss the misunderstandings regarding the Thomas family charity and explore mutually beneficial resolutions. It's obviously a trap." "Or an opportunity," I said. Isaiah's security chief, a former Marine named Daniel Chen, entered the office at that moment. He'd clearly been briefed already because his expression was thunderous. "Absolutely not. This is textbook predatory behavior. Hale wants you isolated, vulnerable, where he can threaten or potentially harm you. Men like him don't request civil meetings, they orchestrate confrontations." "But he won't do anything in a public restaurant," I countered. "Too many witnesses, too much exposure. He'll try to manipulate me, yes, but I'll be safe enough physically." "Safe enough isn't the same as safe," Daniel said flatly. "And manipulation can be as dangerous as physical threats. He's a professional at this. You're not." He was right, and I knew it. But something in me refused to back down. I'd spent my entire life avoiding confrontation, accepting whatever treatment people chose to give me, retreating rather than standing my ground. Richard Hale had killed my mother. He'd destroyed my family. And now he thought he could buy me off or scare me into silence. "I'm going," I said, hearing the certainty in my own voice. "Face to face. I want to look him in the eyes and let him know I'm not afraid." Isaiah and Daniel exchanged a long look, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Isaiah nodded. "All right. But we do this properly. Full security detail maintaining visual contact throughout. You'll be wired with recording equipment, audio and video if possible. Every word he says gets documented. And at the first sign of real danger, the team extracts you immediately." Over the next 2 days, they prepared me like I was going into a war zone. Daniel's team taught me how to recognize threats, how to signal for help if needed, how to keep Hale talking while staying safe. They fitted me with a recording device so sophisticated it was invisible, a tiny camera disguised as a button on my blouse, a microphone woven into the fabric itself. The night of the meeting, I dressed in clothes that projected quiet confidence. A navy dress, simple jewelry, understated elegance. Isaiah squeezed my shoulder before I left. "Remember, you hold the power here. He needs something from you, or he wouldn't be meeting. That means you have leverage." Marcello's was exactly the kind of restaurant I'd never been able to afford, dim lighting, white tablecloths, waiters, who moved like dancers between tables of wealthy patrons. The hostess led me to a corner booth where Richard Hale was already waiting.
He was older than his photos suggested, late 60s, with silver hair, perfectly styled, and features that radiated distinguished authority. His suit was immaculate, probably custom-tailored in Italy or London. Everything about him screamed respectability, success, power. This was the man who'd murdered my mother. "Miss Thomas," he said, rising with old-fashioned courtesy. "Thank you so much for accepting my invitation. Please sit. I've taken the liberty of ordering wine. I hope you don't mind." His voice was smooth, educated, genuinely warm. If I hadn't known what he was, I might have found him charming. He gestured to the wine glasses already on the table, to the breadbasket, to the menu. Playing the gracious host. "You've been through quite an ordeal," he continued, his tone sympathetic. "The situation with your family must be devastating. I understand these federal investigations can be terribly disruptive." I said nothing, just watched him, and something flickered in his eyes. Approval, maybe. He liked that I wasn't falling over myself to respond, that I was making him work for my reaction. "Let me be direct," he said, abandoning the small talk. "I know you've been working with Isaiah Ward. I know what you're investigating, and I'm here to offer you a way out of this unfortunate situation." He reached down beside his chair and lifted a leather briefcase onto the table. Opening it with theatrical precision, he revealed neat stacks of documents that I recognized immediately as bearer bonds, untraceable financial instruments as good as cash. $500,000, he said quietly. "Yours immediately. Tax-free. Untraceable. All I need is for you to step away from this investigation, return to your life. Let the legal process handle your family's situation without your involvement." The amount was staggering. Life-changing money. Enough to start over anywhere, to build whatever future I wanted. And all I had to do was abandon my pursuit of the man who'd killed my mother. "Your family is already caught," Hale continued, his tone almost fatherly now. "Melanie will face prosecution regardless of what you do. Your father's finances will be scrutinized. The charity will be shut down. These consequences are inevitable. But you don't have to destroy yourself in the process. Why help Isaiah Ward settle an old business grudge when you could take this money and build a new life?" "No," I said simply. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between us. The warmth in his eyes cooled by several degrees, though his smile remained perfectly in place. "I see," he said quietly. "Then let me help you understand the full picture. I know where you're staying, Isaiah's mountain compound, very secure, very impressive. I know you've been reviewing financial documents, building a case. I even know about that charming scar on your left knee from when you fell off your bike at age 7. The point, Miss Thomas, is that I know everything about you." The threat was clear despite his polite delivery. He was telling me he could reach me any time, that his knowledge extended into my childhood, into my most private spaces. "If this investigation proceeds," he continued, his voice still reasonable and calm, "Melanie will be arrested first. Your father will lose his job, his pension, his reputation. The Thomas family name will be destroyed in your community. And you, Valerie, will be the one who caused it all. That's how they'll see it. That's how the story will be reported. Not as justice, but as a daughter who destroyed her own family." He leaned forward slightly. "I can make all of this go away. The investigators can be redirected. The charges can be reduced or dismissed. Your family can survive this relatively intact. All it takes is your cooperation, or rather your absence." But Hale made one mistake. He underestimated me. I returned from the restaurant meeting with Hale's threats still ringing in my ears, but something had shifted inside me during that confrontation. He'd expected me to be intimidated to accept his money or cower before his implied threats. Instead, I'd seen his strategy laid bare, recognized the desperation underneath his polished confidence. He was afraid of what Isaiah and I could prove, afraid of losing control of a situation that had always bent to his will. That fear was a weakness, and I was learning to exploit weakness. Back at the compound, Isaiah's team reviewed the recordings from my meeting with Hale. Every word, every gesture, every subtle threat had been captured in perfect clarity. But it was what Hale hadn't said that interested me most. The gaps in his confidence, the way his eyes had hardened when I refused his money, the quick calculation that crossed his face when I remained unmoved by his threats. "He's losing control of the narrative," I said to the team gathered around the conference table. "For 20 years he's manipulated people through fear and money. But he can't manipulate Isaiah because Isaiah has more resources than he does, and he can't manipulate me because I have nothing left to lose." David, the forensic accountant, leaned forward. "So, what are you thinking?" An idea had been forming since the restaurant, crystallizing as I reviewed Hale's patterns of behavior. His entire operation depends on trust. He trusts that the people he's paid will stay loyal. He trusts that his son will follow orders. He trusts that his network will hold together because everyone has too much to lose by betraying him. But what if we broke that trust? Isaiah studied me with sharp attention. "Go on. What if we made Hale believe Mark is cooperating with authorities?" I pulled up files on Mark's involvement in other Hale operations. Mark knows everything, where the money comes from, where it goes, how the network operates. If Hale thinks his own son is turning state's evidence, he'll panic. And when people panic, they make mistakes. Sarah Chen nodded slowly. "A false flag operation. Make Hale think there's a betrayal when there isn't one." Exactly. I was already sketching out the strategy. We create evidence that Mark met with FBI agents. Nothing that actually breaks laws. We don't fake official documents or impersonate federal officers. But staged photographs intercepted communications that suggest cooperation, leaked information through channels we know reach Hale's surveillance network. Daniel frowned. "That's sophisticated psychological warfare. Are you sure you want to play at that level?" "Hale killed my mother," I said quietly. "He destroyed my family. He tried to intimidate me in a restaurant 3 hours ago. I'm not playing. I'm fighting back with the only weapons that work against someone like him, his own paranoia and mistrust." Isaiah's expression was unreadable for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right. Let's build the operation. But carefully. Every step documented, every action legal. We're not becoming criminals to catch a criminal." Over the next 48 hours, we executed the plan with surgical precision. Isaiah's team staged a meeting between Mark and 2 men who happened to be former federal agents, now working as licensed private investigators, completely legal. They photographed the encounter from multiple angles, making it look like a covert discussion in a parking garage. We drafted fake communications, not official FBI records, but text messages and emails that suggested Mark was considering cooperation, that he was afraid of his father, that he wanted immunity in exchange for testimony. Then we leaked it all through channels we knew Hale monitored. The response was faster and more dramatic than we'd anticipated. Within 24 hours, Hale's security team deployed full surveillance on Mark. We watched through our own counter-surveillance systems as they followed him, photographed him, likely tapped his phones and emails. The paranoia we'd planted was bearing fruit, but the real prize came on the 3rd day. Hale, in his panic about Mark's supposed betrayal, began moving money rapidly through his network. Transfers that should have been carefully spaced and disguised were instead executed in hurried succession. Offshore accounts to shell companies, to laundering operations, to legitimate businesses, all within 72 hours, instead of the usual careful months-long process. "He's hemorrhaging operational security," Sarah said, tracking the money flows in real time. "These transactions are traceable, sloppy. He's so focused on hiding assets from Mark's supposed testimony that he's creating a perfect evidence trail for us." I watched the money move across the screens, each transaction, another nail in Hale's coffin. I'd weaponized his trust issues against him, used his own paranoia to make him self-destruct. It felt like justice, but cold and calculated rather than emotional. Isaiah stood beside me, watching the same screens. "You're a natural strategist, Valerie. Most people can't think 3 moves ahead like this. You've turned Hale's greatest strength, his control over people through fear, into his greatest vulnerability. But the operation yielded something even more valuable than financial evidence. Mark, genuinely terrified by his father's sudden investigation into his loyalty, made a critical mistake. Feeling isolated and threatened, he reached out to the one person he thought might still trust him, Melanie. Our monitoring systems intercepted the messages almost immediately. They came through in a panicked rush, Mark's usual careful composure completely shattered. "Mel, I need to talk to you. Not on the phone. My father is investigating me. I think he knows I've been having doubts. I'm scared of what he might do." Then, in subsequent messages, "I never wanted this to go so far. The payments from Dad, the things he made me do with your family's charity? I was just following orders. I didn't have a choice. You understand that, right? You know I never wanted to hurt anyone." And finally, the message that made my heart race. "He told me specifically to target your sister first, then you. He said the Thomas family needed to be controlled because of something their mother did years ago. Mel, I think my father killed Valerie's mom, and I think he'll kill me if he believes I'm talking." Sarah pulled up the messages on the main screen, and we all read them in stunned silence. Mark had just confessed in writing and digital communications we could authenticate and present as evidence to conspiracy to following Hale's direct orders to knowledge of murder. He'd connected himself and his father to the money laundering operation and implicated Hale in my mother's death. "He doesn't know he's creating evidence," I said quietly. "He thinks he's confiding in someone loyal, someone who won't betray him." Isaiah looked at me carefully. What happens next will push Melanie to a breaking point. Mark just gave her information that makes her a critical witness. When Hale realizes Mark has been communicating with her, when he understands what Mark revealed, both of them become liabilities. And what happened next would push Melanie to the breaking point. I knew confronting Melanie with Mark's messages would be devastating, but I wasn't prepared for how completely she would shatter. Isaiah arranged for us to meet at a neutral location, a private room in a hotel conference center, secure and quiet. Melanie arrived looking hollow, her usual careful makeup unable to hide the dark circles under her eyes, or the weight she'd clearly lost in the past weeks. She looked at me with something between hope and terror, as if I might offer salvation or deliver final judgment. "I have something you need to see," I said, placing my tablet on the table between us. Mark's messages to her filled the screen, his panicked confessions laid out in chronological order. "Mark has been communicating with you. He doesn't know we've been monitoring his messages." Melanie's face went white as she read. Her hands trembled, reaching toward the screen and then pulling back as if the words might burn her. When she reached the part where Mark admitted following Hale's orders, where he confessed to targeting our family deliberately, something inside her broke. The tears came first, then the sobs, then broken sentences that tumbled out between gasping breaths. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know it was this bad. I thought I convinced myself he loved me, that it was real." "Melanie," I started, but she cut me off. "He has photos of me." The words came out in a whisper, shame and fear thick in her voice. "Intimate photos. From a night when I was drunk, when I could barely stand. I don't even remember most of it. But he showed them to me later, told me if I didn't sign the papers he needed, if I didn't do what he asked, he'd post them online. Send them to everyone we know. Destroy my reputation." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "He was blackmailing you. I fell in love with him." Melanie continued the words, pouring out now like she'd been holding them back for years. "He was so attentive, so interested in everything I said. He made me feel special, important. By the time I understood something was wrong, I was already trapped. He had those photos. He had evidence that I'd already signed some documents. He said if I stopped cooperating, he'd make sure everyone thought I was the mastermind behind the fraud." I saw my sister differently in that moment, not as the manipulative golden child I'd resented, but as another victim of Mark and Hale's calculated cruelty. She'd been groomed, exploited, blackmailed. The signatures on those documents hadn't come from greed, but from fear and coercion. "But you framed me," I said quietly. "When the investigators started asking questions, you threw me under the bus to save yourself." Melanie's face crumpled with genuine shame. "I know, God, Valerie, I know. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd fix it later, that you'd understand once everything settled down. I never imagined Dad would actually throw you out. I never thought... She broke off, unable to finish. When I heard you were gone, that you'd disappeared into the snow that night, I was terrified you were dead. I was terrified I'd killed my own sister. Isaiah, who'd been standing quietly near the door, spoke for the first time. Trauma reveals character, Valerie. Your sister isn't evil. She's weak. She chose self-preservation through denial and deflection, sacrificing you to protect herself. You chose confrontation despite personal cost. But weakness that enables evil still requires accountability. Understanding why someone did something terrible doesn't erase the harm they caused. Melanie nodded, accepting the judgment without argument. I deserve whatever happens to me. Prison, probably. Public humiliation, definitely. But Valerie, you need to know something else. Something about Dad. I waited, feeling the weight of another revelation approaching. Before you started dating Mark, Dad ran a background check on him. Melanie said, her voice steadier now. He found irregularities, Mark's connections to shady businesses, unexplained income inconsistencies in his history, but Dad didn't care. He was excited because Mark seemed wealthy and well-connected. He told me Mark would be good for the family's social standing. When you broke up with Mark, Dad actually pushed me to stay friendly with him. He practically threw us together. The betrayal layered upon betrayal. Our father had known Mark was suspicious, had evidence of his connections to criminal enterprises, and had deliberately encouraged the relationship because it served his social ambitions. There's more, Isaiah said, moving to stand beside me. His expression carried the weight of something he'd been holding back for weeks. It's time you knew everything about your mother. He pulled out a file, the one marked with her name that I'd seen glimpses of before. This time he opened it completely, spreading documents across the table. Police reports, witness statements, photographs of a car wreck on a mountain road. 15 years ago, your mother was volunteering with a charity called Hope Haven Foundation, Isaiah began. She discovered Richard Hale was using it as a money laundering front. She gathered evidence, transaction records, testimony from other volunteers who'd noticed irregularities. She was preparing to take everything to the FBI. He pulled out a document, a witness statement dated 2 weeks before my mother's death. This is from a man named Thomas Garrett who worked for Hale at the time. He's now in witness protection, which is why this statement was sealed for so long. He heard Hale on the phone talking to someone about the Thomas problem. Hale said, and I quote, "If she talks, she won't walk. Make it look like an accident." My vision blurred. The conference room seemed to tilt and spin. 2 days later, your mother's car went off a mountain road. Isaiah continued, his voice gentle but unwavering. Brake failure, the police report said. But a mechanic who examined the wreckage noticed evidence of tampering brake lines that had been partially cut, designed to fail at speed. He reported it, but the investigation was shut down quickly. Hale had connections in the police department, politicians he'd bought. The case was ruled an accident and closed. All these years. 15 years of believing my mother died in a tragic accident, never knowing she'd been murdered for trying to do the right thing. Never knowing Richard Hale had orchestrated her death to protect his criminal enterprise. And then years later, I said, my voice barely audible, he targeted our family's charity, using Mark. It wasn't random, it was revenge, punishment for what my mother tried to do. Yes, Isaiah confirmed. And insurance. By controlling your family by having Mark monitor you all. Hale ensured that if anyone ever started asking questions about your mother's death, he'd know about it immediately. You were all hostages without even knowing it. There was only one person left to confront my father. I needed one more day before I could face my father. One day to absorb the truth about my mother's murder, to process Melanie's confession, to prepare myself for a confrontation I'd been avoiding my entire life. Isaiah arranged the meeting at his compound in a formal conference room designed to feel neutral and controlled.
My father arrived looking defensive, his jaw set, his posture rigid. He'd dressed in his best suit as if appearing professional might somehow shield him from accountability. I had all the documents laid out on the table, evidence of his fraud records, of Mark's background check, proof of his willing participation in Hale's operation. But those weren't what I needed to confront him about. Not really. Why? The word came out harder than I'd intended. Why did you always treat me like I was worthless? Why did you make me believe I was a burden to this family? He looked away, his hands clenching and unclenching on the arms of his chair. Valerie, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time, I interrupted. You threw me out on Christmas Eve. You accused me of crimes you'd committed. You've spent my entire life making me feel small and unwanted. I deserve to know why. The silence stretched between us, thick with decades of unspoken pain. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as if the words were being dragged from somewhere deep and ugly inside him. Because you're exactly like your mother. He still wouldn't look at me. Stubborn, righteous, always questioning everything, always standing up for what's right, even when it would be easier to just go along. After she died, I couldn't look at you without seeing her, without being reminded every single day that I failed to protect her. My breath caught. This wasn't an apology. This was an accusation. It was easier to push you away than face what I'd lost. He continued, his voice breaking. Easier to be angry at you than to admit I was angry at myself. So yes, I treated you poorly. I compared you unfavorably to Melanie. I punished you for things that weren't your fault. Because every time I saw your face, I saw her face, and I saw my own failure. What failure? I demanded, though part of me already knew the answer. He finally looked at me, and the anguish in his eyes was real. I knew Margaret was in danger. Hale had threatened her not directly, but through intermediaries. He made it clear that exposing his operation would have consequences. I begged her not to go to the authorities. Begged her to just let it go, to walk away to protect our family. But she wouldn't. She said it was the right thing to do, that people were being hurt, that she couldn't stay silent. Tears were streaming down his face now, years of suppressed guilt finally breaking through. And then she died. Her brakes failed on that mountain road, and I knew, God help me, I knew it wasn't an accident. I knew Hale had killed her, but I was too afraid to say anything. Too afraid he'd come after you girls next. Too afraid of losing everything. The confession hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating everything it touched. So yes, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. When I look at you, I see the person who got her killed. That same moral certainty that won't bend, won't compromise. That conviction that doing the right thing matters more than safety or comfort. I blamed you for being like her because blaming you was easier than blaming myself for being a coward. The ugliness of it was breathtaking. For 15 years, he'd punished me for possessing the qualities he'd admired in my mother, but had been too weak to support. He'd transferred his guilt and shame onto me, made me carry the weight of his moral failure, destroyed my self-worth rather than face his own cowardice. I tried to speak. Tried to tell him that his cruelty had shaped my entire life, that I'd spent decades believing I was fundamentally unworthy of love, because he'd taught me that lesson every single day. Tried to tell him that he'd killed something essential in me, just as surely as Hale had killed my mother. But when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. I tried again, forcing air through my vocal cords, but there was only silence. Not a whisper, not a rasp, nothing. My hand went to my throat in panic as I realized what was happening. My voice was gone. Completely gone. My father's expression shifted from anguished confession to alarm. Valerie, what's wrong? Are you okay? I tried to speak again, desperate now, but my body had shut down that ability entirely. The emotional overload, the trauma of hearing my father admit he'd blamed me for my mother's death, the weight of 15 years of psychological abuse. It was too much.
My mind had found a way to escape by simply refusing to let me speak. He stood up, reaching toward me. "Valerie, I'm sorry. I didn't mean I shouldn't have said." I backed away from him, tears streaming silently down my face. Apologies now meant nothing. He'd had 15 years to say these things, 15 years to acknowledge his failure and change his behavior. Instead, he'd waited until I forced the confession from him, and even then he'd made it about his pain, his loss, his cowardice. The door opened, and Isaiah entered, taking in the scene with immediate understanding. His expression when he looked at my father was colder than I'd ever seen it. "You've taken enough from her," Isaiah said, his voice like ice. "We're leaving." He wrapped a protective arm around my shoulders, guiding me toward the door. I looked back once at my father sitting alone at the conference table, surrounded by evidence of his crimes, and finally facing the ruins his choices had created. He looked old, diminished, broken by truths he could no longer avoid. But I felt no satisfaction in his suffering. Only emptiness where my voice used to be. It was time to end Hale's empire. The doctor Isaiah brought in the next morning confirmed what I'd suspected. Psychogenic aphonia, she called it, a temporary loss of voice triggered by severe psychological trauma. My vocal cords were physically undamaged. My body had simply shut down that function as a protective response to unbearable emotional pain. "It will return when you feel safe again," the doctor said gently. "When your mind believes it's okay to speak, don't force it. Let it heal naturally." I nodded, already reaching for the notepad and pen that had become my constant companions. I had work to do, and I'd discovered something liberating in the previous 24 hours. My power had never depended on my voice. The ability to speak was convenient, but not essential. I could still think, plan, strategize, and execute. In the conference room that afternoon, I gathered Isaiah's core team and wrote out my strategy in careful detail. They watched as I filled pages with diagrams, calculations, and step-by-step plans for a trap that would force Hale to expose his entire operation. "You want to create a fake investment opportunity," Sarah said, reading over my shoulder. "Large enough that Hale can't resist, urgent enough that he has to move quickly." I nodded and wrote more. "Make him activate the entire network. Force him to show us everything." David leaned forward, studying my notes. "If we design this correctly, when he tries to process this phantom money through his system, he'll have to activate every account, every shell company, every laundering channel he has. It would give us a complete map of his operation in real time." I wrote, "Exactly. He won't be able to resist." Greed plus time pressure equals mistakes. Over the next 3 days, Isaiah's team constructed the bait with meticulous care. They created documents for a fictional wealthy investor from Singapore, someone interested in making large charitable donations for tax purposes, someone with urgency due to fiscal year deadlines, someone with enough money that Hale would see this as a career-defining opportunity. $50 million, they decided. Enough to be irresistible, but not so large as to be obviously fake. They positioned the opportunity through intermediaries Hale trusted, leaked information through channels they knew he monitored, built a paper trail that would pass his initial verification. Everything was designed to look legitimate while remaining entirely legal on our end. No forgery, no impersonation of real entities, just carefully crafted fiction that Hale would want to believe. The trap was set on March 4th. Within 6 hours, Hale had taken the bait. I sat with Isaiah's forensic team watching on multiple screens as Hale activated his network to accommodate the supposed $50 million donation. Money didn't actually move. It couldn't since the investment was fictional. But Hale's preparation to receive it required him to open channels, verify accounts, contact associates, and essentially map out his entire infrastructure for us. Accounts in the Cayman Islands lit up on our tracking systems. Shell companies in Luxembourg processed verification requests. Laundering operations in Panama received preparatory communications. And all of it, every transaction, every communication, every account number was being documented in real time by our monitoring systems. "He's showing us everything," David whispered, awe in his voice. 20 years of operation completely exposed in 72 hours because he couldn't resist one big score. But our trap was only the final piece of a much larger case. Isaiah pulled up files his team had been compiling for months, witness testimonies from former Hale associates who'd turned against him, internal documents from whistleblowers inside his organizations, 5 years of charity transaction records showing patterns of fraud, and IRS reports detailing suspicious financial activities. The evidence was overwhelming even before our operation. What we'd added was the irrefutable proof of current active money laundering that would make conviction certain. Sarah compiled everything into a comprehensive evidence package. "This is bulletproof," she said, reviewing the documents one last time. "Multiple sources corroborating evidence, clear patterns of criminal activity spanning 2 decades. And our recent operation showing him actively attempting to launder what he thought was $50 million. Isaiah made the call to the FBI contact he'd been working with for months. "It's ready," was all he said. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of waiting, of watching news channels, of wondering if Hale would somehow evade justice one more time. My voice remained absent, but I found I didn't miss it as much as I'd expected. There was power in silence, in watching and listening without the obligation to respond. Then on March 15th, it happened. The news coverage started at dawn, federal agents executing coordinated raids on multiple Hale properties simultaneously. His downtown office building, his estate in Connecticut, the offices of 3 charities he was connected to, properties belonging to known associates. The operation was massive, involving dozens of agents, and the media captured every moment. I watched from Isaiah's study, the morning news playing on multiple screens. There was Hale himself being led from his home in handcuffs, his distinguished silver hair disheveled, his expensive suit looking suddenly shabby. The man who'd killed my mother, who'd destroyed countless families, who'd operated with impunity for 20 years, was finally facing consequences. I felt something settle in my chest. Not savage triumph or vengeful satisfaction, but something quieter. Balance being restored. Justice delayed, but finally arriving. Isaiah sat beside me, watching the same coverage. "Revenge isn't about destruction," he said quietly. "It's about refusing to let evil go unchallenged. About standing up when everyone else would rather look away." I reached for my notepad and wrote, "This is for every woman he thought was powerless." Isaiah read it and nodded. "Your mother would be proud. She stood up to him too, even though it cost her everything. Now you've finished what she started." My voice was still gone, but in that moment I understood it didn't matter. I'd brought down a criminal empire without saying a word. My silence had become its own form of power, proof that strength doesn't require volume, that power comes from conviction and courage, not from the ability to speak loudly. But Hale wasn't the only one who would fall. Hale's arrest was only the beginning. Within 48 hours, the FBI's investigation expanded to his entire network of associates and accomplices. Press conferences announced additional arrests, asset seizures, accounts frozen across multiple countries. The operation Hale had built over 20 years was collapsing in days. Mark Anderson was high on the list of targets. Isaiah received the notification from his FBI contact on March 9th. Federal agents would execute Mark's arrest the following morning. He asked if I wanted to be there to witness it. I wrote on my notepad, "Yes, I need to see it." We positioned ourselves across the street from Mark's apartment building in one of Isaiah's SUVs with tinted windows. Daniel and his security team maintained a perimeter, ensuring we could observe without being exposed to potential danger. The morning was cold and gray, matching my mood. The FBI arrived at 7 a.m., a coordinated team moving with practiced efficiency. They entered the building, and we waited. 15 minutes later, they emerged with Mark between 2 agents, his hands cuffed behind his back. He looked different than I remembered. Thinner, older somehow, though only weeks had passed since I'd last seen him. His carefully maintained appearance had crumbled, unshaven hair, uncombed, wearing sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt, like he'd given up on the persona he'd cultivated for so long. As the agents guided him toward their vehicle, his gaze swept across the street and found me through the tinted window. I don't know how he knew I was there, but our eyes locked for just a moment. What I saw in his face wasn't the defiance or calculation I'd expected. Just exhaustion, defeat, maybe even relief that the performance was finally over. Then he was gone, placed in the back of an FBI vehicle and driven away. Over the next 2 days, Melanie's attorney coordinated her full cooperation with federal investigators. In exchange for her testimony and evidence against Mark and Hale, prosecutors agreed to recommend reduced charges, acknowledging her status as a victim of blackmail while still holding her accountable for her knowing participation in fraud. Isaiah's team received copies of her testimony, and reading it was like watching a horror story unfold in legal language. Melanie detailed how Mark had cultivated a completely false identity, claiming family wealth that didn't exist, creating a backstory about prestigious schools he'd never attended, manufacturing references and connections that were pure fiction. He'd researched our family for months before ever approaching me at that coffee shop, learning our vulnerabilities, understanding our dynamics, identifying exactly how to infiltrate our trust. But the timeline was what devastated me most. Mark had begun preparing to target our family 2 full years before we'd met. Before he'd first smiled at me over coffee and asked about my day. Before he'd held my hand and told me I was special. Before every moment I'd treasured as genuine connection. It had all been a mission, a job, an assignment from his father to infiltrate, monitor, and ultimately control the Thomas family for Hale's purposes. Yet Melanie's testimony also revealed something I hadn't expected. Mark had developed genuine feelings for me that complicated his assignment. According to intercepted communications between Mark and his father, Hale had repeatedly reprimanded his son for becoming emotionally compromised by the target. Mark had apparently resisted orders to break up with me, had delayed tactics Hale wanted implemented, had even suggested to his father that maybe my family wasn't the right target after all. It didn't excuse anything he'd done, but it added complexity to someone I'd wanted to see as simply evil. He'd been a criminal, yes, but also a damaged person raised by a sociopath, trained from youth to exploit others for his father's gain, trapped in a role he'd never had the courage to escape. On March 12th, Mark's arraignment was scheduled at the federal courthouse. Isaiah arranged for us to attend, positioning ourselves where we could observe without being directly in Mark's path. But fate or chance intervened. As Mark was being transferred from a holding area to the courtroom, the marshals took a route that led directly past where I was standing in the hallway. Isaiah tried to guide me aside, but I stayed where I was. I wanted Mark to see me. Wanted him to face what he'd done to someone who genuinely cared about him. The marshals were moving Mark efficiently down the corridor when he saw me. He stopped so abruptly that the marshal beside him stumbled. The officer made to continue, but Mark resisted, his eyes locked on mine. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. The words tumbled out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for years. "Valerie, I'm sorry. I loved you. I really did. But I was never strong enough to choose you over him." Something shifted in my chest, like a door that had been locked suddenly opening. I felt words forming, felt my throat engaging after 11 days of silence. Love without courage is just cowardice in disguise. My voice came out scratchy and weak, barely above a whisper, but it was there. Real. Present. The words hung in the courthouse hallway, cutting through everything else Mark might have said, distilling the truth into one simple declaration. His face crumpled. The marshals, seeming to sense something significant had just occurred, gently resumed, guiding him forward. He looked back once as they led him away, and I saw tears on his face. Isaiah's hand squeezed my shoulder. "Your voice," he said quietly. "It came back." I touched my throat in amazement, feeling the vibrations as I spoke again. It came back. The words were clearer this time, stronger. My body had decided I was safe enough to speak again, that I had something worth saying, that silence had served its purpose. The silence had been powerful in its own way, forcing me to choose my actions carefully to demonstrate that strength didn't require volume. But having my voice return at the precise moment I needed to deliver that truth to Mark felt like a gift, like some cosmic acknowledgement that I'd earned the right to speak again. Isaiah guided me toward the courthouse exit, his security team forming a protective perimeter. "There's something I need to tell you," he said as we reached the car. "Something I should have told you weeks ago, about why I've been helping you, about my real connection to your mother." But one last twist awaited me, one Isaiah had kept secret. That evening, Isaiah invited me to his private study, the room where we'd first looked at the documents exposing my family's crimes. It felt significant that we were returning here now, after everything that had happened, after all the truths that had been revealed. But I sensed there was one truth left, one piece of the puzzle I still didn't understand. Why had Isaiah Ward, billionaire tech mogul, cared so much about helping me? He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, something he'd never done before, and gestured for me to sit in the leather chair by the fireplace. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, like he was preparing himself for something difficult. "I need to tell you the full truth," he began, settling into the chair across from me. "About why I've been helping you. About my real connection to your mother." I waited, my newly returned voice still feeling tentative and fragile. 20 years ago, I was running my first startup, SecureCore, the company that eventually made my fortune. But back then, I was barely surviving. Living in a 1-bedroom apartment, eating ramen, working 100-hour weeks, desperately trying to make the company succeed. He paused, staring into his glass. "Your mother worked as my administrative assistant. She was the only employee I could afford to hire, and even then I could barely pay her minimum wage." The image was so different from the mother I'd known, the woman who'd been a stay-at-home parent for most of my childhood. I'd never known she'd worked in tech. "Margaret was remarkable." Isaiah continued, his voice warming with the memory. "Not because she was brilliant with technology or business, she wasn't, but because she cared about people, about doing things right. One day, I received a buyout offer from a company called Sentinel Investments. The offer was incredible, far more than my startup was worth. I was ready to accept it to finally escape the financial pressure." He took a drink, his expression darkening. "But Margaret researched the company on her own time. Spent evenings in the library. This was before everything was online, digging through business records and newspaper archives. She discovered Sentinel Investments was a front for organized crime, that they were buying tech companies to launder money through seemingly legitimate operations. If I'd accepted that buyout, I would have become complicit in money laundering without even knowing it." My mother had saved Isaiah Ward's entire company, saved him from the kind of criminal entanglement that would have destroyed his reputation and possibly his freedom. "She warned me," Isaiah said, "showed me everything she'd found. And then she said something I've never forgotten: power is useful, but integrity makes it last. I turned down the buyout, barely survived another year, but eventually found legitimate investors. Everything I built after that, all of this," he gestured around the room, "exists because your mother cared enough to protect someone she barely knew. I told her that if I ever succeeded, I'd repay that debt," he continued. "But by the time I had the resources to truly help, she was gone. When I learned about her death, about the suspicious circumstances, about Hale's involvement, I investigated. I learned everything: the threats, the tampered brakes, the investigation that was shut down too quickly." His voice tightened with old frustration. "I wanted to help your family, to honor my promise to Margaret by protecting her daughters. But your father refused all contact. He was ashamed that Margaret had worked, embarrassed that she'd had to take a minimum wage job. He wanted to pretend that part of her life didn't exist. He returned my letters unopened, hung up when I called. So I watched from a distance, monitored your family's situation, waited for a moment when I could actually help. The pieces were falling into place: why Isaiah knew so much about me, why he'd been positioned to help that night in the park, why he'd invested so much in bringing down Hale. When I saw you giving your boots to a dying stranger in sub-zero weather, sacrificing yourself without hesitation for someone you didn't know. His voice caught. I knew Margaret's daughter had her heart. That's why I chose you, Valerie. Not out of pity, not because you were convenient, but because I recognized in you the same moral clarity that your mother possessed, the same courage to do what's right regardless of personal cost. I felt tears building but held them back, needing to hear the rest. Isaiah set down his glass and stood moving to the window where moonlight illuminated the snow-covered peaks. But there's more. Something that connects to why destroying Hale mattered so much to me personally. He turned back to face me, and I saw pain etched deeply in his features. 22 years ago, I had a younger sister, Emma. She was brilliant, an accountant who could see patterns in numbers that others missed. She discovered that Richard Hale was defrauding investors in a rival tech company. She gathered evidence prepared to expose him. His hands clenched into fists. Hale destroyed her. He fabricated evidence that she was embezzling, got her fired, blacklisted her from every firm in the industry. Within 6 months, she couldn't find work anywhere. The shame, the isolation, the constant accusation, she couldn't bear it. She took her own life. The words hung heavy in the air. I understood now why this had been so personal for Isaiah, why he'd pursued Hale with such determination. I was 28 years old, building my company, so focused on success that I didn't see how badly she was struggling. Isaiah said, his voice breaking. I failed to protect her. I was her big brother and I failed. By the time I realized how serious it was too late. He looked directly at me, tears visible in his eyes. When I saw you falsely accused, just like Emma, abandoned by your family, just like Emma on the verge of destruction, just like Emma, I saw a second chance. This time, the good person wouldn't be destroyed. This time, I wouldn't fail to protect someone who deserved protection. This time, we'd fight back together. And we'd win. Understanding crashed over me. I wasn't just fulfilling Isaiah's promise to my mother. I was also his attempt at redemption for his sister. His way of correcting a failure that had haunted him for over 2 decades. Thank you, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion. For telling me. For everything. Isaiah nodded, composing himself. There's one more thing. One final conversation we need to have. And then he offered me the future I never dared to imagine. Isaiah walked to his desk and pulled out a leather folder, the kind used for important legal documents. He placed it on the table between us, but didn't open it immediately. I've spent the past 2 decades building companies, accumulating wealth, wielding power in the tech industry, he said. I've been successful by any conventional measure. But I've never built something that changes individual lives the way your mother changed mine. Something with the personal touch that only someone who's lived through injustice can bring. He opened the folder, revealing documents I didn't understand at first glance, incorporation papers, financial statements, organizational charts. I want to create a charitable foundation, Isaiah continued. One dedicated to helping women who've been financially exploited, abandoned by their families, or victimized by corrupt systems. Women like you, like my sister Emma, like the victims in all those files I showed you of families Hale destroyed. He paused, his eyes holding mine. And I want you to be the founding director. Full operational control. $50 million initial endowment. The mission starts now, even though the legal paperwork will take 6 months to complete. The proposal was so enormous, I couldn't immediately process it. Not just the money, though. $50 million was an incomprehensible amount. But the trust it represented. The belief that I, someone who'd been homeless just months ago, could lead something this significant. Why me? I asked, my voice still carrying that scratchy quality from its recent return. Because you have 3 things that can't be taught, Isaiah replied. Moral authority, you've lived through the injustice you'd be fighting against. Lived experience, you understand the vulnerability of people trapped in systems designed to exploit them. And most importantly, integrity that's been tested and proven. You chose truth over family loyalty, justice over comfort, courage over safety. Those aren't common qualities, Valerie. They're rare. And they're exactly what this foundation needs. I looked at the documents at the mission statement outlined in careful legal language at my own name listed as Founding Director, Margaret Thomas Legacy Foundation. My mother's name. This would be named for my mother. I'll do it, I said. But on one condition. Isaiah raised an eyebrow, interested. Complete transparency. Public financial reports posted quarterly online. An independent board with authority to audit and question any decision I make. External oversight to ensure no one person, including me, can ever abuse this position. The words came easier now, my voice growing stronger with conviction. I've seen what happens when good intentions hide bad actions. This foundation will be different. We'll help people rebuild their lives, but we'll do it with the kind of integrity my mother would recognize. For a moment, Isaiah just looked at me. Then a smile broke across his face. Genuine pleasure, mixed with respect. Done. Immediately. I'm impressed you insisted on those safeguards, even when you're the one being trusted. That's exactly why you're the right person for this. Over the following weeks, news media coverage intensified. The story had everything journalists loved. Corruption exposed a billionaire's involvement, a whistleblower who'd sacrificed everything for truth. But what surprised me was how the narrative focused not on victimhood, but on courage. I wasn't portrayed as someone who'd been rescued, but as someone who'd fought back and won. The woman who stood up to corruption and refused to be silenced, one headline read. Another called me the whistleblower who brought down a 20-year criminal enterprise. The coverage was overwhelming, but Isaiah's PR team managed it carefully, protecting my privacy while allowing the truth to reach the public. Then the legal outcomes began to finalize. Richard Hale's sentencing hearing was held on March 23rd. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom watching as the judge delivered a 30-year federal prison sentence without possibility of parole. Hale was 72 years old. He'd likely die in prison. The man who'd killed my mother, destroyed countless families, and operated with impunity for 2 decades would spend his remaining years in a cell. I felt no triumph in the moment, just a quiet sense that balance had been restored. Mark Anderson's sentencing came next, 15 years in federal prison, with credit for his cooperation against his father. He'd agreed to testify to provide details about Hale's operations, to help authorities identify other victims and recover assets. The cooperation would reduce his sentence but not eliminate it. He'd still serve over a decade for his crimes. When I saw him at the sentencing, he didn't look at me, just stared straight ahead, accepting his fate with the resignation of someone who'd finally stopped running. Melanie's plea deal was finalized the following day. 3 years supervised probation, $200,000 in fines and restitution, permanent ban from serving in any charitable organization, leadership role, mandatory community service, and intensive therapy as a condition of probation, but no prison time. Her attorney had successfully argued that Melanie was a victim of coercion, the blackmail with the intimate photos, Mark's manipulation, Hale's exploitation of her psychological vulnerabilities. Most importantly, those photos were sealed by court order and then destroyed under judicial supervision. Mark could never use them as weapons again. My father's legal outcome was more complicated. Federal prosecutors determined he'd been complicit, but not a primary actor. He faced substantial financial penalties, over $300,000 in fines and restitution, and lost all professional licenses. He could never serve on a charity board again, could never hold positions of financial trust. But given his age and peripheral role, he avoided criminal prosecution. The outcomes weren't perfect. Justice rarely is, but they were real, concrete, proportional to the harm caused and the intent demonstrated. Hale and Mark, who'd planned and profited most, faced prison. Melanie, who'd been manipulated but had still made harmful choices, faced consequences without complete destruction. My father lost privileges without losing freedom. It was enough. It had to be enough. There was only one thing left, closing the chapter with my family. I returned to my childhood home on April 1st, 3 months and 1 week after being expelled on Christmas Eve. The house looked exactly the same from the outside, same brick facade, same front porch, same windows glowing with afternoon light. But everything had changed. Isaiah's security team waited in the SUV while I walked to the door alone. This was something I needed to do myself. My father answered on the second knock, and the man who opened the door barely resembled the one who'd thrown me out. He'd aged years and months, his face gaunt, his posture stooped, wearing the visible weight of his choices. "Valerie," he said, his voice rough. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." We sat in the living room where I'd been accused on Christmas Eve. The decorations were gone, replaced by a stark emptiness that felt appropriate. My father settled into his chair, the same one he'd sat in while banishing me, and tried to begin an apology. "I was trying to protect the family," he said. "Everything I did was to keep us together to—" "No." The word came out firm and clear. "You were protecting yourself from consequences. There's a difference." He flinched, as if I'd slapped him, but I continued. "I've forgiven you," I said, watching his expression shift from surprise to hope. "Not because you deserve it, not because what you did was acceptable, but because carrying your betrayal around is too heavy a burden, and I'm choosing to set it down." "Thank you," he whispered. "I know I don't deserve—" "But forgiveness doesn't mean trust," I interrupted. "It doesn't mean we go back to how things were. It doesn't mean I'm returning to being the daughter who absorbs your failures and enables your choices. Forgiveness means I'm free to move forward without being anchored to your guilt." My father began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. For 28 years, my instinct would have been to rush to comfort him, to make his pain go away, to sacrifice my own needs to ease his distress. But I stayed in my chair. Some pain must be felt. Some consequences must be endured. Comfort too quickly offered becomes enabling. The door opened and Melanie entered, looking smaller and more uncertain than I'd ever seen her. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose, her usual polished appearance replaced by something more raw and honest. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. "Just us." We moved to the kitchen, the room where we'd shared countless meals as children. She poured coffee with shaking hands, and we sat across from each other at the table where Mom used to help us with homework. "I'm in therapy," Melanie said, 3 times a week, trying to understand how I became someone who could do what I did to you. The therapist says I learned helplessness that Dad trained me to avoid responsibility by always rescuing me. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "Can we ever be sisters again?" I considered the question carefully. "We can build something new. Not sisters the way we were, because that dynamic was toxic, but 2 adults who share history and want better for each other. That requires you to grow, Mel, to face who you've been and choose differently." She nodded, accepting the conditional nature of my offer. "I want to. I'm working on it. It's hard realizing how much I hurt you." "I'm starting a foundation," I told her, "to help women who've been exploited and abandoned. When you're ready, really ready, not just to avoid consequences, but because you genuinely want to help others, come volunteer. Learn what it means to serve without taking, to give without expectation of return." "I will," Melanie promised. "When I'm ready, when I've earned it." We didn't hug goodbye. Some distances require time and effort to close. But when she walked me to the door, there was understanding between us that hadn't existed before. The possibility of something real eventually, if we both did the work. I walked to the SUV where Isaiah waited, carrying only one thing from the house, a framed photo of my mother. In the picture, she was laughing, her eyes bright with life and warmth. The mother who'd taught me that kindness was strength. The woman who'd saved Isaiah's company and paid with her life for standing up to evil. I was wearing new boots Isaiah had given me, Italian leather, perfectly fitted, expensive enough to last a lifetime. But in my bag, carefully wrapped, I'd kept the old torn boots from Christmas Eve. The ones I'd given to a dying stranger in the snow. They were damaged, worthless by any practical measure, but they represented the moment my life transformed. The moment kindness led to power instead of exploitation. Isaiah looked at me as I climbed into the vehicle. Are you okay?" I glanced back at the house one final time. My father stood at the window watching me leave, Melanie beside him. Both of them diminished by their choices, both facing long roads of their own. Then I looked forward at the road stretching ahead toward the mountains and the work waiting for me there. "I spent 28 years trying to earn their love by destroying myself," I said. "But I don't need their love anymore. I have my own respect, and that's enough." As we drove away, I watched in the rearview mirror as my childhood home grew smaller and finally disappeared, the past receding. And through the windshield, I saw mountains rising ahead, snow-covered peaks catching the afternoon sun, beautiful and vast and full of possibility. And for the first time in my life, I finally felt free. 6 months later, the Margaret Thomas Legacy Foundation officially opened its doors. The building wasn't ostentatious, just a renovated office space in a quiet neighborhood where women could come without feeling intimidated or judged. Inside, we'd created spaces that felt safe and warm, consultation rooms where financial advisors helped untangle exploitative situations, legal aid offices where attorneys worked pro bono, and a community room where women shared their stories and realized they weren't alone. On opening day, I stood at the entrance greeting our first clients, and I saw myself in every face that walked through those doors. Women who'd been told they were worthless. Women who'd sacrificed everything for families that gave nothing back. Women who'd finally found the courage to demand better. Isaiah stood beside me, not as a benefactor hovering over his charity project, but as someone who genuinely believed in what we were building. Melanie was there too, having completed 6 months of intensive therapy and ready to begin her volunteer work helping women navigate the complex emotions of family betrayal. She had a long road ahead, but she was walking it honestly. My father wasn't there. We'd spoken twice since April brief conversations where he updated me on his life, and I shared carefully limited information about mine. The relationship would never be what he wanted, but it was what I could give. That had to be enough. As I watched women enter the foundation throughout that first day, each one carrying stories of pain and survival, I thought about Christmas Eve, about standing in the snow, freezing and homeless, believing I'd lost everything. I'd thought that was my ending. I didn't know it was actually my beginning. The journey from that frozen park bench to this moment hadn't been easy. It had required confronting ugly truths, facing powerful enemies, and accepting that some relationships couldn't be saved. But it had also shown me that strength comes in forms we don't always recognize. That kindness with boundaries is more powerful than kindness without them. That forgiveness can free you without requiring you to forget. That family is something you build through actions, not something you're obligated to accept because of blood. My mother had been murdered for trying to do the right thing. She'd lost her life fighting corruption. But her death hadn't been meaningless. The foundation bearing her name would help countless women find the courage she'd shown, the strength she'd possessed, the integrity she'd never compromised. Some stories don't have neat endings where everyone reconciles and lessons are learned without cost. Real life is messier than that. But sometimes messy endings are also honest ones. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't bringing your family back together. It's learning you don't need their approval to have value. I kept those old torn boots in my office displayed in a shadow box with a small plaque that read, "The night everything changed." They reminded me daily that one act of kindness in my darkest moment had set everything else in motion. That when I had nothing left to give, I gave anyway. And that generosity offered without expectation of return had somehow saved my life. This is a story about betrayal and revenge, yes. But more than that, it's a story about discovering that you're stronger than the people who tried to break you. That truth matters more than comfort. That justice, while imperfect, is worth fighting for. And that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is permission to walk away from people who will never value you properly. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been told your kindness is weakness, if you've ever sacrificed yourself for people who never sacrificed for you, I want you to know you're not alone. Your story matters. Your courage matters.
and you deserve relationships built on respect, not obligation. Thank you for taking this journey with me, for listening to a story that wasn't always easy to hear but was always true to the complicated reality of family power and justice. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own relationships differently, if it gave you courage to set boundaries you've been afraid to set, please subscribe to this channel and let me know in the comments below. What part of Valerie's story resonated most with you? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own well-being? What would you have done in her situation? Your stories matter, and I'd love to hear them. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone who's been made to feel small by people who should lift them up, please share this video with them. Sometimes we all need a reminder that we're stronger than we think. Until next time, remember, you don't need anyone's permission to value yourself. That power has always been yours. And for the first time in my life, I finally felt free.